Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel and welcome to my Omnibus series. I've got so many of these omnibuses that are going to come out so that you'll be able to listen to an hour's worth of stories, which I know you're going to love. You know, the thing is that telling stories is such a fine art, and it's something that was practiced hundreds of years ago when people didn't have the technology that we have today. And everyone would gather around the fire and listen to a wonderful story. And also, what is so wonderful about a story is that personally, I think it is the best way to go to sleep. Every night when I go to bed, I always listen to stories. And that's something that parents used to do with their children. It's something that they still do with their children. There's nothing better than a good story. And so I hope you're going to enjoy this series. And before we start, I just want to say, do subscribe to my channel because you don't want to miss out on anything. Because I'm in for the long haul and I want to make sure that you get the most stunning stories to go to bed with at night or to listen to when you want to be one of those people sitting beside the fire and listening. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and let's get started. I hope you're going to enjoy the omnibus.
Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, I was certainly not comfortable with taking in a lodger, but I soon realised I really didn't have an option in the matter. That is, if I wanted to perpetrate the privilege of living in my detached 50s home outside of Seattle. My previous tenant, the ailing Mrs. Lansbury, was an elderly woman who eventually had moved to a nursing home. She had become incredibly frail, feeble and wasted in recent years. And then after taking a nasty tumble down my staircase, she had fractured her hip very badly. Inevitably, after the hip replacement surgery she had received, followed by extensive physiotherapy, you would have expected her to recover swiftly. But not so. Things went steadily downhill from thenceforth. Instead, she became enfeebled and debilitated, so through no choice of her own, had been actively encouraged by her paediatrician to receive ongoing frail care from a nursing home. Ostensibly, it had broken my heart, as Yvette Lansbury had become like a quintessential grandmother figure in my life. I dreaded the unpalatable, inexpedient prospect of some perfect stranger moving into my home that I didn't even know anything about. I was certain their objectionable presence would be intrusive and invasive. I loathed the prospect of being uncomfortable in my own home, but it seemed infinitely more preferable than having to sell up and move away to somewhere a lot smaller, so I was really running out of options. I had lived in my current home for over 30 years, raising both my daughters here, so even the walls and very foundations of this place evoked wistful, nostalgic memories of my children's fleeting, evanescent childhoods. I say fleeting, for children grow up all too quickly. Before you know it, they're married and raising children all of their own. I had to pinch myself and wonder where all the transient time had got to, as it had slipped away as butter does on a corn cob, really fast. My husband had tragically, fortuitously passed away from a brain aneurysm in this house over 15 years ago, so I had been left a widow for what seemed like a lifetime now. I was now far too intractably set in my ways to ever consider getting married again. Besides, I didn't want to, and I had begun to enjoy my personal space in my own home, and to appreciate my independence. To all intensive purposes, living in this charming house that beheld so many poignant happy memories would never be easy to sell. I lived in a companionable neighbourhood where people were on first-name terms with each other. It was a lively, convivial community, close to a local town with excellent shopping opportunities, eclectic boutiques, fascinating bookshops, antiques, cafes and restaurants. Yet where I lived was still very rural and rustic, as the houses on the right-hand side of my street overlooked a viridescent woodgrove, made up primarily of tall, statuesque Douglas firs and ponderosa pine trees, that sprawled out for many miles into an area of magnolious, splendiferous national forest. I didn't even have a dividing wall in my backyard, which really meant this forest was an extension of my own home. Over the years I had thoroughly enjoyed a plethora of local indigenous wildlife visiting us regularly. One year a mother mountain lion had brought all 3 of her cubs to play in my yard. They were romping and clowning around on our back porch. The mother grooming her young appeared unfazed, undaunted and untroubled by my presence, as I watched the cat family on the opposite side of the window. I remember me and my 2 daughters, Tally and Rona, watched in fascination as these mountain lions grew from the cutest timorous kittens into rarely formidable, magnificent mountain lions. I mean, we saw them growing up, from kitten to cat. It was better than any wildlife documentary you might watch on television. We had grown very attached to those wild cats that over the years had dropped around to my backyard to reminisce, and also to investigate the area where they'd interacted and engaged with each other as younger cubs. I always knew which cat was which by their distinctive markings. We had named them all, so I could tell if the cat visiting us was Sabo, Serengeti or Safari, or was the original mother Sago. On many occasions I'd seen foxes, black bears, even deer, and on one occasion a mother grizzly, all scampering around my lawn at some point in time. My resplendent yard boasted an opulent rich orchard with pear, plum, apple and peach trees that exponentially helped to invite the wildlife onto our property, along with a plethora of rather exotic fruit-eating birds, which I would watch transfixed for hours at a time from my swinging chair on the back porch, while thoroughly enjoying a Manhattan or margarita cocktail. Life didn't get better than that. It was hardly a wonder I didn't want to leave my home. I was fortunate to have a silvery pond that my late husband had constructed. It was surrounded by weeping willow trees and scattered with the most gorgeous pink water lilies. So let's just say having a natural watering hole for the animals was also another obvious attraction for the wildlife. My house was a prepossessing double-storey, pretty symmetrical white-bricked house with a grey slate roof and generous French windows. I'd given it that quaint, rather enchanting, quintessential English country cottage feel to it by growing rambling clusters of pink-climbing roses on the exterior front wall. The individualistic houses on our street ranged from elegant Victorian, Queen Anne, Craftsman, 50s, 80s, and your more popular ranch-style homes. Most of the properties had decent-sized front and backyards, with perfectly manicured verdant green lawns and flower beds full of clusters of colourful perennial flowers in season. The asphalt road on our street was fringed by neatly laid red brick pavement, with large elm trees on either side of the road, so it was a very pretty neighbourhood to live, with houses that went on the market fetching steep prices, embodying the epitome of town meets country. It was on a Tuesday morning when I started to interview some potential tenants interested in letting out a room in my home. I knew this wasn't going to be an easy exercise, as I had heard some horror stories of unruly, rowdy tenants renting out rooms in people's houses that on the surface appeared to be very amenable, but the package does not always reveal the contents, as a person's character is not always pronounced on your first acquaintance. It's a little like going to the grocery store, picking out what you consider to be the best avocados, but I can't recall the amount of times I've opened up a perfectly good avocado to discover it's rotten on the inside. Interviewing tenants is a little like playing blind man's buff, or pulling out a lucky ticket from a magician's hat, hoping you have got lucky this time. The first woman who I showed around my home and interviewed was a young lady called Adele in her 20s. She looked like one of those bohemian swinging 60s hipsters, with long dark hair and a long dress which she wore over black leggings. She possessed a carefree, nonchalant attitude, as if she didn't have a care in the entire world. She asked me if I was all right with her keeping a pet. Now, I'm not adverse to domestic pets, but when I discovered that she had a 5-metre python that was so enormous, I knew there was no way I could have a tenant like her living with me along with that unorthodox pet slithering around my home. By all accounts, she was attached to the python, describing it to me as the most beautiful pet that she'd ever owned. She brought it out of her trunk to introduce the thing to me, which she wrapped cordially around her neck. Granted, it was a magnificent specimen, with beautiful brown markings. She told me that she slept with her python every night, but recently she had made changes to her sleeping arrangements after a horrifying revelation from her vet. I was terribly worried about poor Percival here. She's so delightful. The poor darling hadn't eaten for 2 whole months. He was losing a ton of weight. It seemed he was refusing to eat. He had absolutely no interest in food. It must have been 2 months and he hadn't eaten a single thing. I thought he must be terribly sick. Naturally, I was beside myself with worry. Well, that is rather unnerving, I admitted, especially when a pet doesn't eat. And with an exotic pet like yours, it's even more enigmatic. You won't believe what my vet told me. I could hardly absorb it myself. He told me that the reason that my little Percival here had not eaten for so long is because he's been preparing for a very large meal. And the meal is me. He's literally been starving himself so that he can eventually make room for me. I was gobsmacked. You mean your pet has not been eating so that he can end up eating you? That's exactly right, she said. Now, I don't hold it against Percival, of course. I mean, how could I? It's not something I take personally. He's such a beautiful specimen, and I'm sure that underneath it all, he really does love me. I'm not sure wanting to eat your owner is my idea of love, I'd said. But surely you're not going to sleep with him now that the vet has told you why he's not been eating for very long. I hope you've heeded his warning. No, I'm not going to sleep with him at night. It's an awful pity, but what can I do about it? My friends for ages have been telling me I'm far too attached to Percival, and that sleeping entwined with a snake every night is not perhaps the best idea. Well, I think your friends are right, I said. You don't know what the snake could get up to while you're fast asleep. What is the saying? When the cat's away, the mice do play. Hypothetically, when you're out for the count, the same symbolism seems to apply. You're right about that. I'm going to be very straight and to the point. How do you feel about me and Percival moving in? We won't be any trouble, I assure you. Percival is a very contented snake. He's very happy when he finds somewhere warm to sleep. He'll curl up and be very content. I had dreadful visions of finding Percival curled up in a dryer after I'd done a load of washing, or lying by my range when I was cooking a pot of beef soup. It wasn't a pretty picture by any manner of means. I tried to smile at the young lady. I'm afraid my smile seemed rather forced and insincere. Look, you're a terribly nice lady. Adele, she reminded me. Oh yes, Adele. Forgive me, I'm not good with remembering names. Now, I like you, Adele, very much. Percival is also a fine, spectacular snake. I need only look at him to know this is the case. But I'm afraid Percival is a contentious, controversial issue for me. Your vet's horrifying revelations about Percival's intentions to eat you up, shall I say, are ever so slightly disturbing. If Percival got out during the night, he could end up dining on me, or worse still, my domestic tabby Esther. I just couldn't allow that to happen. You must understand, it's a very bad idea. Well, you could lock your cat away, couldn't you? Then Percival won't get to your cat. And if you sleep with your bedroom door shut, it shouldn't be a problem. That's a high risk for me, I'm afraid, Adele. Number one, this is Esther's home. Why should I lock my cat up? Number two, I like to sleep with my door slightly ajar. And even if I didn't, Percival could be cosily coiled up under my bed. It's very warm under there. I could wake up in the night with him slithering all over me, coiling his long girth around my neck. Oh, the very thought, it's just too dreadful to even comprehend. I'm sorry, I really am, Adele. You're a nice girl, but it's an absolute no from me. Why is everyone so against Percival? Piped Adele indignantly. It's blatant discrimination being prejudiced against an exotic animal. You wouldn't be feeling the same way if I had a tank of goldfish or a cat, would you? Probably not, but your snake is a liability or a risk I'm not prepared to take, Adele. I'm sorry, I can't have that snake under my roof. I'd never sleep comfortably in my bed at night. Well, thanks very much, said Adele, stomping out of my house. Me and Percival are being victimised, she said. It's not right. You're being unreasonable. The next lady I interviewed was a feisty woman called Tammy, with a short sweep of ginger-coloured hair. At first I thought she seemed quite amenable, until she promptly walked into my kitchen with an audacious confidence, opening up my fridge like one of those condescending diet experts you see on those ghastly weight-loss television programmes. I can see when I move in, she dictated, there are going to have to be a lot of changes around here. For a start, this ice cream in your freezer has got to go. And as for your pop-up tarts, your Toblerone and your strawberry jelly, they need to be binned at once. No one should have these atrociously unhealthy things in their store cupboard. Do you realise how bad chocolate is for your health? If you want to eat chocolate, by all means do. But you need to eat the dark stuff. This Toblerone, no, it's not good. She looked at me disdainfully through her purple-rimmed glasses, rather like a patronising snobby schoolmistress reprimanding a wayward student for misbehaving atrociously. "You may be very slim, my dear, but don't be fooled by your outer appearance, which can be dubiously misleading and deceptive, as I'm always warning people. You don't know what's going on inside your body. You mark my words, your internal organs are screaming for healthy foods. I'll revamp your lifestyle. Your health will improve exponentially," she declared. "You'll be a brand new woman by the time I've finished with you. You'll be so glad I moved in. I'll introduce you to the pleasures of transcendental meditation and yoga. Oh, my word, you'll feel fabulous. Do you know I drink wheatgrass every morning and make a berry smoothie with kale?" "I'm sorry, Tammy, you won't be moving in. I'm not going to swap my lifestyle for blueberries and wild oats, I'm afraid. I'm looking for a tenant that complements my lifestyle, not conflicts with it." Tammy looked at me in horror. "You're in denial, are you not? If you continue to eat all this dreadful ice cream and chocolate, all these unhealthy foods could make you dead in 10 years. "I'm not worried about that," I told her. "I'd rather die happy than miserable nibbling my way through a plethora of carrot sticks every year. I've nothing against healthy eating, but someone dictating how I should live my life is World War III in the making. Besides, if you tell me to give up chocolate, I don't know what you're smoking. Chocolate is one of life's richest pleasures that I'm not about to give up any time soon." The irony is this woman who was lecturing me a dime to a dozen looked as if her all-natural lifestyle had made her as miserable as hell, for there wasn't even a glimmer of happiness on her sultry face, but this determination to live by a rigorous regime that was not clearly making her happy. "May I ask you something, Tammy?" "Go ahead," said the woman. "As you can see, I'm an open book. What you see is what you get. One thing about me is there are no secrets." "I can see that," I said, "and it's refreshing. Tell me, Tammy, are you happy?" "What a strange question to ask. What the hell is that supposed to mean?" "Well, is your lifestyle making you happy? Isn't there a little moment when you don't fantasize about a piece of chocolate cake? I mean, you're awfully self-disciplined." "You say that as if it's a bad thing. But discipline is my entire life." "Yes, of course I dream about chocolate cake all the time. But the big difference between you and me is that I never give in to the temptation. Never, ever. Not even for a fleeting second. As for happiness, that's an adjective. What's that supposed to mean anyway? I don't think anybody is happy all the time. They just get on with their lives, don't they? You know what, I think you're tough on yourself, Tammy. I think you should treat yourself sometimes. Give in to temptation once in a while. We only live once." I watched Tammy leaving my home. Ironically, I felt rather sorry for her. I could sense that there was a trapped wildcat inside her, wanting to come out, but she was bound by a terrifying fear of committing a cardinal sin, eating something considered unhealthy. I couldn't help thinking that it's the consummate extremes in life that make us unhealthy. It seemed to me Tammy's extreme thinking in regards to her lifestyle and healthy eating was robbing her of the freedom of choice and balance, which in itself is not healthy. The third person applying to my advert was a young man who was very polite and civil. He told me his name was Oliver, and compared to the last two tenants, he seemed so refreshingly normal. He didn't own an exotic pet, nor was he fixated by a rigid dietary regime. I remember secretly thinking, "Thank God!" He was very interested in my property, most especially the woodgrove in the backyard, which he asked if he might inspect. I told him to be my guest, and he returned to say that the woodgrove was most suitable for his needs, which I thought was an odd thing to say, as while he would enjoy the benefits of walking in the woodgrove, it was my bedroom he was renting. "I've lived around here all my life," he told me, "but the house where I'm staying is being refurbished by the current landlord. I'm looking for temporary accommodation. Your bedroom and bathroom ensuite will suit me very nicely, so if you'll have me, I'm very, very keen. I do like the whole situation here. It suits me down to the ground." The word temporary rang in my head joyfully, so I found myself agreeing for Oliver to move in forthwith. Most of the time I barely even knew he was here. He was always out during the day, returning late every night. In truth, he was as elusive as the Scarlet Pimpernel, but that suited me absolutely fine. Oliver would leave the house every day, locking his bedroom door behind him, insisting that he would clean his own personal space himself. But soon after he moved into my bright, normally sunny home, with its convivial, warm atmosphere, it was as if a cloying, oppressive darkness had suddenly descended over the place. I began to have this ongoing, unsettling feeling that I was being watched all the time, by predatory, tenacious eyes that I couldn't see, that would send cold shivers of trepidation darting down my spine. Sometimes in my peripheral vision I was almost certain I'd seen a dark shadow, but when I turned around to look, nothing was there. This kind of experience has never happened to me before. It would leave me wondering if I was actually losing my mind. I must confess I was heartily relieved when my best friend Bobby popped around for tea. He seemed so uncomfortable in my kitchen, his eyes darting around my home like an alarmed ferret. He shivered and looked at me with a bemused expression on his face. "What's going on here, Janine?" he asked me. "What do you mean?" I'd asked, looking nonplussed. "I don't know. You tell me. Your house feels very different, not as cosy and warm as it usually does." "In what way?" I asked. "I'm not sure, but it feels as if something is watching us. Have you made any changes to the house recently?" "No, I can't say that I have, although I do have a new tenant." Bobby frowned. "I tell you, I don't like you having strangers staying here at your home. You know nothing about them. What do you know about this tenant of yours?" "Nothing," I said. "That's my point, Janine. Your house feels heavy, bodeful, very gloomy. This isn't good. You need to keep a firm eye on this Oliver character. There's something distinctly off about your home, but I can't put a finger on it yet. If the energy shifted in your home soon after Oliver moved in, what does that say about him? Maybe he's not all he seems." "But he's in his early 20s. He seems a nice character, polite and very well dressed." "That doesn't mean anything, Janine. Surely you know that by now. Outer appearances can be very deceptive. I'm sure Ted Bundy looked presentable, but it doesn't mean he actually was. Did this young man have any character references from previous landlords by any chance?" "Well, I didn't ask for that." "Well, you should have. It's always a good idea to check on someone's character, Janine. You don't know who's living in your house." I must admit, Bobby's ominous words had disturbed the cockles of my mind, ruffling my feathers a wee bit. But I reassured myself that Oliver was a young man in his 20s. By all accounts, he was a graciously courteous person, who worked in town during the day at the local bakery. There was nothing untoward about him that raised a red flag to me, as he looked as normal and regular as your average 22-year-old. In truth, he was very debonair, and conservatively dressed, as well as well-spoken. I reassured myself that perhaps houses need to adjust to the energy of new people, which was why my house was slightly off-centre at the moment, but it would soon settle down. I will admit that there were strange, outlandish things that began to occur in my home that could not be explained, all aligning with the time that Oliver moved into my property. One morning I distinctly remember making up my bed, but when I returned to my bedroom, the bed covers had been ruffled up, as if I'd been sleeping there. I stood there in the doorway wondering if I was losing my mind. I was absolutely certain I had made my bed only moments before, but it was all completely messed up now. I could hear my cat crying. To my amazement, I found poor little Esther trapped in my closet, looking very disgruntled. When she saw me, she hissed, lashed out with her paw, scratching me on my arms, drawing blood, then scurried down the staircase like a bullet, as if something had scared her half to death. Nothing ever riled the fur of my lackadaisical, carefree, silver-grey cat, but something had upset her so much, to such an extent that I never saw sight or sound of Esther for 2 more days, which was most out of character for her. She usually waddled from the bed to her feeding bowl throughout the day, only ever venturing to the cat litter tray whenever she needed to attend to business. The vet had told me if I didn't get her to exercise a wee bit more, she could join the realms of the morbidly obese any time soon. One night I woke up to see a dark, shadowy figure with malicious, vindictive red eyes staring at me at the end of my bed. But it happened so fleetingly and so fast, I was almost convinced that I'd imagined it. I was so disorientated and confused, wondering if I'd experienced some kind of heinous, lucid nightmare. The umbrious figure had seemed so real, Those red eyes had been hauntingly menacious and threatening, but I couldn't be sure at all if it had been a hallucination of some kind or not. I climbed out of my bed cautiously, in a bewildered, befuddled, rather vague state. My mind seemed to be drawing sixes and sevens, part of me absolutely certain that I'd been visited by a demonical entity of some kind. Even now the hauntingly vivid, grotesque, hideous, disembodied image kept resurfacing in my mind again and again, like a video image you can't relinquish. I promptly decided that I'd go downstairs to fix myself a much-needed cup of coffee to calm myself down. I was too bemused about what I had or had not witnessed moments before to react in an appropriate way accordingly to what I'd seen. Should I be petrified? But if it was just a random nightmare, then it was water off a duck's back, surely. Nothing to get my knickers in a twist about. I tiptoed out of my room onto the landing so as not to awaken Oliver, who would need to be getting up early in the morning for his shift at the bakery soon. It was tenebrously dark on the landing. No moonlit shadows softened the gloomy twilight. I was enveloped and hugged by what I can only describe as an inauspicious, bodeful feeling that got my heart thundering in my chest so fast that I could hear every single beat. I sensed something was seriously off. I got the overwhelming sense that I was being watched by something intrinsically evil, rather like the demonical entity I'd sensed before, at the end of my bed. I could feel an ominously heavy presence that made me recoil in horror. A curiosity of note consumed me, while the hair at the back of my neck stood up on end, rather like the prickles from a hedgehog. There was an unfavourable flickering light coming from beneath Oliver's bedroom door. I tiptoed over to it cautiously, realising that this light I was seeing must be emanating from a candle of some sort. How extraordinary, I thought. The man was up. I could hear a low mumbling chanting sound coming from his bedroom. I decided that he was doing some kind of meditational mantra. Maybe he was a yogi, I thought. It was all rather odd. He didn't strike me as a yogi. He was far too uptight for that kind of lifestyle. I put my ear to his door, as my curiosity continued to be aroused. As I did this, something pushed me violently hard, so that I was flung from Oliver's door across the landing, nearly taking a tumble down the sweeping staircase. Something had definitely pushed me, but what? It had been a physical push, but Oliver was behind the bedroom door, so something else had literally pushed me. It scared the living hell out of me. What on earth was going on? I would talk about it with Oliver in the morning, but by the time I woke up, he had long since left the house for his bakery job. The following night I retired to bed, long before Oliver returned home, which wasn't unusual. I couldn't ask him any questions about the burning candle, or the baffling incongruous chanting sounds that came from his bedroom, but I was very concerned with having been pushed away from his door like that by an invisible, forceful hand. I was awoken from my deep sleep to the click of Oliver's bedroom door being closed behind him, the key being turned and twisted in the lock. He had returned home late as usual, as my clock registered 11:30 at night. The young man had been out all day. I assumed he was going to sleep, but there was something inscrutable, nebulous and clandestine going on with him. Whatever paradoxical and ambiguous thing it was, I certainly needed to get to the bottom of it, but it would have to wait, be put on the back burner, so to speak, as the young man must be exhausted, I thought. I awoke a while later to another peculiar sound that grabbed my attention. I wasn't sure what it was, but it gave me an uneasy feeling. I sat up in my bed, my ears standing up, rather like an alert guard dog. Esther, my cat, who was lying curled up in my arms, let out an ominous growl. Again, behaviour very contradictory to a nonchalant, dispassionate cat, who was never ruffled up by anything. I untangled myself from the cat's body, reaching for my dressing gown, which I wrapped around me, and put on my slippers. I briefly glanced at my bedside clock. It was now 12:30 at night. I had woken up a full hour later. I was standing in my doorway when I saw a hooded figure carrying a paraffin lantern in his hands, gliding down the sweeping staircase. I knew it had to be Oliver, but what was he doing at this time of the night? I quickly trailed behind him, trying to be as discreet as possible. I could see his hooded figure, along with several others just like him, all carrying similar lanterns, disappearing into the woodgrove, one after the other in a straight line. They were up to something nefarious, I thought, but what? My hackles began to rise as I quickly threw on a pair of sneakers and a headlamp and ventured out into the woodgrove for myself. I needed to find out what Oliver was embroiled in, and what these hooded, mysterious, dark-cloaked figures actually were. It wasn't too dark a night, I'm glad to say. There was a full moon gracing the firmament. Its gentle silvery shadows warmly dappled the backyard in a soft ethereal light that offered a small measure of comfort, while the twinkling stars in the velvety sky seemed to dance in the twilight, rather like diamonds from heaven. The night was filled with the chorus of crickets and frogs, while in the distance the wailing sound of wolves could be heard. Their echoes travelled far and wide across the woodgrove. I nearly jumped out of my skin when an owl flew past me and let out a very pronounced hoot that was so close, too close to call. I trailed behind the murky, spooky silhouettes with a stealthful resolve, an unrelenting, steely determination. It was easy to follow them. The wavering lights of the lanterns highlighted the way. I promptly switched off my own headlamp to avoid detection. I tiptoed, taking care to be as quiet as possible. I had never ventured out into the woodgrove at night before. It seemed strangely inauspicious, very menacing, as if a formidable, heavy blanket had cloaked the woodgrove in a thick, cloying ambience. It was almost as if the trees were whispering, "Get out! Get out!" as if I was unwelcome in this place. There was a slight breeze blowing through the tall ponderosa pines and Douglas fir trees, which meant that they jiggled their needled boughs, rather like reluctant dancers. But the movements of the trees were woefully discomposing, for something about this night left the hairs on the back of my neck still standing on edge. Still, I was out here now. I needed to see what Oliver was getting up to, in the woods at night. I crept on the earthen floor. It felt pleasantly soft under my feet. I made sure not to lose my footing over a fern or a lone rock, or slip over some moss, which can easily happen. I finally stood behind a tree, watching all the cloaked figures settle down in an open clearing, forming a small circle. I counted over 12 hooded figures. What was this, I wondered? Some kind of devil worship? Such a thought was very distressing and discomposing for me. It certainly would explain some of the untoward activity that was going on in my home at the moment, that I'd put down to an overactive imagination. Now I wasn't so sure. Was Oliver conjuring up demons, I wondered? I watched with bated breath as the figures began chanting what sounded like some kind of demonical worship in a language rather like Latin, but they kept saying, "Hail, Lucifer! Hail, Lucifer!" and bowing their heads in worship. Then one of the robed figures stood up, and in his hands he held a huge white chicken that was clucking away noisily and making a terrible commotion. He twisted the chicken's neck, throwing the decapitated head on the forest floor, where it landed not far away from where I was standing. The man tore the feathered creature apart, squeezing blood into a large silver ornate goblet, which was then passed around from one hooded figure to the next, in order to drink, while the blood-soaked feathers were flying all over the place, rather like confetti, and scattered across the forest floor. "We present this offering to you, great Lucifer," boomed the voice. "We honor you with our praise and thanks and glory." All of a sudden I heard a loud thumping sound. Something hugely heavy and portentous was moving through the forest at an alarming speed. The only way I can describe it to you is it sounded like a trumpeting elephant in musk barging through the woodgrove. The forest suddenly became submissively silent and subdued. Even the crickets and frogs ceased singing. Whatever it was, even before I saw it, I knew that it had to be gargantuan in size, for every single footstep on that forest floor caused the trees to shake, the ground to heave and groan. "It's working!" cried one hooded figure. "It's working! Lucifer is coming! He's received our sacrifice!" I remember my blood turned cold as ice. My whole body began to tremble like a jiggling jello. Had these hooded figures called up the devil himself, I wondered? It seemed more than likely, for I could sense a formidable, threatening presence venturing towards us, getting ever closer. I could also sense a powerful energy. Then I saw it. Nothing prepared me for what I was seeing, as the tall, dark, shadowy silhouette moved towards the large circle of hooded figures with a deliberate, purposeful intent. At first, I really did think it was a demon from hell. Then I realized this intimidating, awesome silhouette that was easily 9 foot tall, built like a giant, covered with long flowing black hair that was blacker than the night, was in fact a Bigfoot. The Bigfoot was absolutely furious. His anger was so tangible I could almost physically feel it. I have never in my life felt a rage like that before, that hit you so fiercely in the face like a block of cold ice. The creature seemed to straighten out his very long torso with pronounced shoulders. Pulling back his thin lips, he let out an ear-piercing scream that was so shrill in its frequency that it went right through me, physically causing my ears to pop, like they do when you go on long-distance air flights. The creature began to pound his chest defiantly, but I didn't get the impression it was an egotistical maneuver on his part. It was more like he was asserting his authority over these hooded figures, telling them categorically who was boss. The Bigfoot grabbed the silver goblet, throwing its contents across the floor in disgust. He began fiercely digging a hole in the ground, grabbing the chicken and head, burying it under the earthen floor, while the hooded figures watched the creature in astonishment. I'm not sure what was going through their heads at the time, as one of the hooded figures began to chant, "Hail, Lucifer! Hail, Lucifer! Hail, Lucifer!" and the others followed on suite, chorusing, "Hail, Lucifer!" This action heightened the Bigfoot's furious frenzy, enraging him so significantly that he promptly dashed over to the hooded figure that had honoured Lucifer. He kicked him so hard with a tree-trunk-sized leg. The young man yelped out in agonising pain, while all the other hooded figures scattered in terror, grabbing their lanterns, running for the hills, their faces obscured and buried by the cloaked hoods. But I'm quite sure they were petrified. The young man that had been hit by the Bigfoot literally crawled away out of the forest, whimpering in agonising pain. The Bigfoot ignored the cloak figures. He frantically began to sweep down the whole area with his overlong arms, where moments before the hooded figures had been gathered for their cryptic ceremony. I could sense the critter was very aggrieved. He began to mutter some kind of mantra, gathering a large pile of rocks in the woodgrove together. He appeared to be placing these rocks strategically in the soil. This took quite some time, but I remained very still, watching in fascination, making sure that I remained very quiet. His human-like face looked visibly distressed. His deep-set dark eyes were benevolent and kind, seemed fired up by indignance. I discerned that this critter was incredibly upset about the devil worship. He had a clear comprehension and understanding of the spirit world, it would seem, and these cloaked figures had been doing something that had made him very unhappy. He began laying the rocks down in the ground in a deliberate, ordered, structured way, and when he had finally finished his arrangement, he stood up and examined his work, seemingly pleased with his accomplishments. He then took a lantern that someone had left behind, sprinkling the remnants of the remaining paraffin on the stones, which ignited with the fire, until it burnt itself out, almost as if it had been a cleansing ritual. I watched in amazement as the creature turned around, glided away into the heart of the forest, and as he moved away, it was like he was floating on air. I walked over to see what design the Bigfoot had imprinted in the ground. To my amazement, it was the symbol of the cross, done in a circle where the cloaked figures had been sitting, almost as if the Bigfoot had tried to extinguish the evil that they had tried to provoke. I turned around and made my way back to my home, and slipped into my bedroom, hardly daring to believe what I had witnessed that night. It would seem my seemingly harmless tenant was steeply involved in devil worship. Now I was convinced that the hooded figure I had seen at the end of my bed one night, with the bright, blazing red eyes, may not have been a figment of my imagination after all, but a very real demonical entity. I had in mind that in the morning I would be telling Oliver that he needed to leave my premises forthwith. I couldn't have someone under my roof engaged in devil worship. Goodness knows what kind of phenomenon he could stir up in my home. Since he'd moved in the house, it had been steeped in a conspicuous, uncongenial atmosphere. That was without a doubt. The next morning when I pottered down to my kitchen, I discovered a note and some money from my tenant Oliver, exclaiming that he had left and would not be coming back. I think that incident in the woodgrove with the Bigfoot must have scared him off. The relief I felt was immense. I called Bobby to tell him what had happened. "Oh my goodness, he's a devil worshipper. I'm coming around now. We need to examine the house to make sure there is no nefarious things lying around the place. Remember the last time I was at your house? I warned you about your tenant. I could feel a heaviness and a very powerful oppressive energy in your home. We're going to need to get the place thoroughly cleansed. I know just the person for the job. I'll give her a call. Before long, Bobby and I were examining my tenant's bedroom. We found melted black candle wax everywhere. And when I moved the rug away from the floor, there was a circular pentagram that had been carved in the wood. I could not believe the brazen audacity of it all. A pentagram in my own home. No wonder the atmosphere was so unconvivial. A lovely lady arrived hours later to cleanse my home, thanks to Bobby. She was a round, short, portly lady in her 60s, with a grey head of hair that was pinned back away from her face in a bun. She spoke in a raspy voice. Bobby had simply asked for a cleansing ceremony to be done on my home. We had revealed nothing to the woman about the nefarious activity that had been going on in my house. "Something very evil has been going on here," she said, looking at me with earnest eyes. "I can feel the presence of an open doorway, or portal if you like, where demons have been invited into your home. They have been given free permission to enter this place. The portal needs to be closed, or your house will become a living hell for you." We followed the woman around my house. She prayed and sprinkled holy water everywhere. When she entered our tenant's room, she froze to the spot. The colour drained from her face. "It is in here, the portal I can find." We showed her the pentagram. We managed to pull the offending floorboards apart out of the floor, which would have to soon be replaced. The woman told me to stand in the room and to tell any spiritual entity that they had to leave, as this was my home. "This is my house. I want you to leave. You're not welcome here. You have to go. You must leave now. This is my house. You must go. You do not have my permission to be here." All of a sudden it was as if a wind current of feisty air pummelled the entire room, but we stood firm on the spot. Then we heard the most horrifying demonical growl that put the fear of God into every cell of my body. But the woman remained stoic and continued to pray. At one time something pushed her so hard she nearly took a tumble herself, but she remained fixed on her prayer and was not easily intimidated. I was incredibly impressed. That was when we saw this black shadow darting around the room, like a huge shadow person. Then the entity morphed into a thick, smoky substance and literally meandered towards the open window, letting out a huge, blood-curdling scream. Then we saw it physically gliding out of the window into the blue sky, like smoke from a chimney. "It's gone," said the woman. "It's gone, and it won't be coming back." She began to sage the entire house. "Thank you so much," I said to the woman, giving her a huge hug. "Be very careful whom you get staying in your house next time," she warned me. I'm glad to inform you that my house returned to its previous congenial atmosphere. I'm pleased to tell you that Bobby decided to sell up his old home, and he moved in with me. So now I don't have to worry about the character of potential tenants. Suffice to say, the mountain lion Safari has been visiting our porch with her offspring recently. So there you are. That's my story.
Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners. Growing up, I had a tough childhood. Well, tougher than most, I would think. It was just me and my dad, whom I loved dearly. I never knew what had actually happened to my mother, as my dad simply refused to talk about her. But when he did choose to broach the subject, he didn't hesitate to use every profanity under the sun to describe her, telling me I was well rid of that whore in my life. Naturally, I wanted to know all about my mother, but I was desperately afraid to ask my dad about her. He would become belligerent and start throwing things around the house like a cantankerous teenager, as if the very name of my mother ruffled his feathers up so much. I knew better than to provoke his pugnacious, bellicose moods by asking him awkward questions that he was not prepared to answer. All I had gleaned from him is that my mother had marched out of the house one day, when I was 3 years old, leaving him a note saying she was never ever coming back.
Needless to say, she left me in my father's charge. It was this regrettable revelation that had made me come to the firm presumption that whoever my mother was, I didn't like her anyway. I mean, what kind of a mother leaves their 3-year-old daughter under the charge and supervision of their father, and never so much as acknowledges her existence ever again, never even sending her a birthday card? So my birthdays would come and go, and no matter how joyous an occasion they would invariably be, they were always sprinkled with a pepper of sadness and regret. I would secretly ponder if my mother was thinking of me at all, or had she clean forgotten about me. I wanted her to be thinking about me, I really did. But another part of me despised her for her apathetic indifference and insouciant dispassion she held towards me. My father was one of those people that was stone-cold sober during the day, but sometimes at night when he returned home, he would have one too many beers. Let's just say he might become intoxicated once in a while, and when he got drunk or inebriated, he would hurl angry accusations at my mother, whom he hadn't seen for many years. I would often wonder why my father hated her so much, that all these years later, whenever he got drunk, he would scream out her name in a frenzied fury, almost as if she had grievously upset him mere minutes ago. I guess that some rivers run deep, and the wounds my father carried after that relationship were festering and putrefying like soiled garbage that becomes rank. It was as if the passing of time had only served to exacerbate the hatred he had for my mother. Was time not supposed to be a healer? It certainly wasn't in my father's case. I would ponder if my father was angry with my mother for dumping me on him. Perhaps he felt strangled and choked by my presence in his life, for he had never been free to marry again. Was he furious with my mother for not taking on her share of the responsibilities in taking charge over me? I suspected that this might be the case, and the thought saddened my heart, as despite everything, I loved my father very much indeed. In my early years, me and my father moved around from one place to another, which I found increasingly frustrating, as no sooner had I begun to make friends in one place and settled down, off we went again, so that we never laid down roots. Imagine a gardener constantly changing the location of a tree he's planting every 3 months. That tree is going to take one hell of a beating. How can it allow its roots to spread out in the ground comfortably and finally settle? It was like that for us. In those days my father could have potentially been described as having ants in his pants, as we could never stay in one place for very long. It was like we were travelling gypsies, although I'm afraid my father's trap was not desperately exciting or nostalgic like one of those old-fashioned gypsy wagons with their horses. It would invariably be the same old roller coaster again and again and again. I would be the awkward new girl in school. The neighbours' curtains would twitch as they gossiped garrulously about the new folk in town. Wherever we went, we felt saliently conspicuous, like pronounced strangers. But then that's exactly what we were, which was never ever a good feeling. I remember finding it enigmatic and inexplicably baffling that my father would sometimes come home and just say, "We're packing up tomorrow and leaving," just like that, without any advance warning. I knew he was serious. His square jaw would tighten. He would run his large hand through his grey hair, in such a way that I knew he resolutely meant business. Naturally, I always asked my father why we were moving away again, especially since I'd begun to feel settled and established in a brand new place. He would tell me he'd got tired of it. His feet had grown itchy. "I've had enough of this dump, sweetheart. We're moving away," he would say. "But Dad, it's not a dump," I would protest. "I really, really love it here." I knew that there was no point in arguing with my willful, obstinate father, who was as stubborn as a mule. Persuading him to change his mind would be as easy as persuading a goldfish to swim on dry land. It was never ever going to happen, so I resigned myself to this reality. I recall thinking we would be better off living in a Winnebago if we were moving around this frequently. I even expressed these feelings to my father, but a Winnebago for him held absolutely no appeal. All this travelling around from one town to another naturally created unnecessary, unwarranted disorder, pandemonium, disruption, upheaval and chaos in my young life, rarely affecting the quality and the standard of my schoolwork. I'd been to over 14 schools in a short space of time, which was ridiculous. My father was a carpenter. His jobs were always cash in hand. As far as I knew, he didn't even have a bank account or a credit card. To all intents and purposes, he would keep a large bag with thousands of dollars in it under our mattress, which I found incredibly useful should I need a spot of cash, for he never counted his money. Suffice to say, my father had very little trouble finding work, so we could pretty much move spontaneously and impulsively anywhere we fancied. The next day he would find gainful employment. On one occasion I attended a phenomenal school, where the teacher there, Miss Caroline Campbell, was just so interested in every one of her pupils. I had never encountered a teacher as intuitive and as inspirational as her. She was one of a kind, like a rose between the thorns. I remember being amazed that she was so focused on me, as all my previous teachers had not really given me a second glance, but this teacher made it her business to learn all she could about me. She appeared somewhat troubled, vexed, and perturbed about my flagging grades, and of course the fact that I was seriously lagging behind in all my schoolwork. That was a huge botheration for her that warranted investigation. When I told her I'd been to over 14 schools, she looked at me with gog eyes like a goldfish. "Are you joking, Lydia? You've been to 14 schools?" I remember she crinkled her forehead in perplexment, furrowing her brow curiously. "But why so many schools? That's ridiculous. I don't understand. That's crazy." "Your father's not running away from the law, is he?" she joked. "He hasn't robbed a bank, has he?" "No," I said, "none of the above. My dad just gets bored of staying in one place all the time." "That's nonsensical," she said to me. "It's exceedingly ungracious and inconsiderate of your father, hypothetically speaking, to keep throwing the sails of your lifeboat down a different course all the time. It can be grievously unsettling for a girl your age. How do you feel about all this moving around, Lydia? Does it unsettle you?" "I don't like it," I said, my eyes suddenly filling with tears. Even I was surprised by my emotional outburst to Mrs. Campbell's question, but it seemed to have hit a soft spot, as the tears just rolled down my face like raindrops. Miss Campbell immediately reached for her purse, pulling out several tissues. "Now wipe your tears, dear, and have a jolly good blow of your nose. It's very good to cry, dear. It's an emotional release. How about your mother, dear? How does she feel about you moving around to so many places like this? Surely she's not on board with this absurd arrangement." "My mother never wanted me," I told her. "She abandoned me when I was 3 years old." "Never wanted you," said Miss Campbell, taking me into her arms and ruffling her hands through my hair. "I very much doubt that, my dear. I think you've got your wires crossed somewhere down the line. You're a silly little mink," she continued. "I'm sure your mother wanted you very much. But grown-ups are very complicated. Things happen along the road. So never assume what you think you know is the truth, because the truth can become very twisted and distorted at times. I'll tell you this unequivocally. I'm sure your mother thinks of you very often. She possibly had her good reasons for leaving. Maybe she thought your dad was in a better position to take care of you than she could financially. Maybe she thought he could give you a better start in life. Or maybe she had an emotional breakdown. You don't know." Miss Campbell took my head in her hands and looked into my eyes compassionately. "Now you listen to me, Lydia. Don't you ever say your mother never wanted you. You hear me? I'm sure wherever she is, she wanted you, and she loves you very much. And I don't doubt this, that she's thinking about you all the time." "You really think so?" "Of course I do." "You think it's true?" I said, wiping away more tears. "But then why hasn't she ever been in touch?" "Well, I imagine it can't be easy," said Miss Campbell, "when you're moving around so frequently. She probably doesn't even have your address. It can't be easy to trace you if you move around this much." I'd never thought of that. My tears dried up fast. I realised Miss Campbell was right. How would my mother know how to contact me when our address was always changing? It made me feel a whole lot better. Maybe my mother had been looking for me. But how would she ever be able to find me when we were always wandering off to another place? I remember Miss Campbell made a point of visiting my father in the rented house where we were living. It was a relatively bog-standard semi-detached home, nothing special to write home about. Situated in a pretty tree-lined neighbourhood, with tall imposing honey locust trees fringing either side of the asphalt road. We also had a verdant, perfectly mown front and back yard, with a scattering of trees, along with beds of perennial flowers in season. I'm glad to say that this time the interior rooms in the home had been painted in pretty colours, so it didn't look quite so beige and wishy-washy and mundane as all the former residents had, which had been painted in standard white colours, and furnished by someone who lacked any imagination. The house we were currently renting had a private fenced-in backyard and a large mature oak tree with a substantial extended branch, where my father had attached my favourite swing. I loved swinging on that tree branch, especially at night, when I could hear the croaks of the frogs and crickets, and gaze up at the velvety black sky, along with the clusters of twinkling stars. I think it was about 7 p.m. in the evening when I opened our front door. I was shocked to see Miss Campbell standing in the doorway. Her timing couldn't have been more perfect, as my father and I had been watching our favourite comedy on television, and finished the pizza slices we had ordered. "Don't mind me, Lydia," she had said. "I need a private word with your father, if I may." Miss Campbell was an attractive woman, with straight blonde hair, who always wore tight black leather skirts above her knees, with tights that had a long black line down the middle, and high patent black shoes, along with glamorous silk shirts. I think my father was rather delighted to open the door to such a glamorous lady, but after her visit to us he seemed to be running rather scared. I remember sitting on the staircase listening in to their conversation. It was a conversation that certainly got me thinking a whole lot, but my thoughts were rather like hot air balloons flying away in the sky, as they weren't based on solid foundations or intrinsic truths, for I didn't know exactly what to think. "Hello, Mr. Joshua. I'm delighted to meet you. I'm Lydia's teacher. My name's Miss Campbell. I'm from the local school. I'm sorry to call on you so late in the evening like this, but I'd appreciate a word with you if I may, concerning your daughter Lydia. It's very important."
"Ah, yes," my father had said. "I'm not normally privileged to meet my daughter's teachers. Please do come in, Miss Campbell. Would you like a glass of white wine?"
"Well, I really mustn't, but maybe one glass, but not more than one glass, as I'm driving."
"Lydia never told me that she had such a glamorous teacher," my father had chided.
"Well, you may wonder why I'm visiting you, Mr. Joshua."
"I was, rather. It obviously concerns my daughter. I hope she's behaving herself."
"Of course she's behaving herself. Your daughter Lydia is a delightful young girl, Mr. Joshua. But it's come to my attention that Lydia has been to over 14 schools. That's an awful lot of schools for a young girl her age."
"What are you implying, Miss Campbell?" My father's voice had boomed. He sounded rather defensive.
"I'm not implying anything, Mr. Joshua. On the contrary, I'm just saying that frequenting so many schools for a 13-year-old girl like your daughter, well, it's not good. It's very unsettling for her. You can see that she can't lay down any solid foundations, being yanked from one school to the next. No sooner has she made brand new friends, off she goes again to another school. It's not easy for your daughter. I know children are remarkably resilient, but 3 new schools in 1 year, Mr. Joshua, that is preposterous. It's not normal. It's exceedingly unfair on your daughter. She was telling me she finds all this moving around very distressing and soul-destroying. And frankly, who can blame her? By all accounts, your daughter is a terribly bright girl. She should be achieving high grades, not the low grades that she's actually achieving now. She should be at the top of her class. It's not her grades that are my chief concern. I'm worried about your daughter's emotional stability with all this chopping and changing in her life. I know she's upset that she hasn't heard from her mother. She emphatically believes her mother never loved her. That's a terrible thing for her to have to think, and I'm sure you agree with that. And I'm also sure it's not true at all. I'm sure her mother loves her very much."
"Well, it can't be helped if we need to move away. If we need to leave, we need to leave. It's as simple as that. I would appreciate it, Miss Campbell, if you would keep your fat nose out of my daughter's relationship with her mother. It's none of your business. Anyway, her mother wants nothing to do with her."
"I'm sure that's not true, Mr. Joshua.
But in regards to the most significant matter we are discussing tonight, your daughter tells me you get bored staying in one place for an extended period of time. But I hasten to say, Mr. Joshua, when you raise a daughter, it's not all about you. It's about being altruistic, self-sacrificing, raising her unselfishly, giving her a phenomenal childhood where she can lay down solid foundations and a plethora of happy lifetime memories for the school years, Mr. Joshua. They're so precious. Your daughter is missing out so much on lifelong friendships, and stability is so important for a child like her. All this moving around, it's so disjointing.
Miss Campbell, I'll have you know, my daughter has plenty of stability. She's raised in a loving family, by a father who loves the bones of her. The fact that her mother sauntered off is not something I can help.
I'm sorry to hear that, Mr. Joshua. It can't be easy for you. Turbulent relationships never are. But I think it would be wonderful for Lydia to reconnect with her mother. Is there any way you can make this happen for her?
I don't know what you think you are, Miss Campbell, involving yourself in the personal affairs of my private life. As I keep telling you, it's none of your business. How I choose to raise my daughter is my business. You're her teacher, Miss Campbell, not her therapist. As for my daughter's relationship with her mother, I keep telling you, it's none of your business.
Now there's no need to get so overheated, Mr. Joshua. For your information, we're both on exactly the same page, singing exactly the same tune. Two of us have one thing in common. We both want the best for Lydia. I only came to offer you a few pointers, that's all. I thought it would be great for you to comprehend what your daughter is going through, Mr. Joshua. She desperately needs stability. It would be so wonderful if you could settle down in one location permanently. That would give her stability, security, and love. Those are the ingredients your daughter needs to thrive, Mr. Joshua.
Thank you, Miss Campbell. You've said your piece. Now I would thank you to go.
But you will give what I've discussed some contemplation, Mr. Joshua.
As I was saying, Miss Campbell, you've said your piece. Now I would like you very much to go.
After Miss Campbell had gone, my father had been pacing up and down our home like a caged tiger in a zoo enclosure. He even picked up a vase from the large wooden coffee table, flinging it violently against the wall.
Bloody bitch, I heard him saying. Bloody bitch, putting her nose in my business. Who does she think she is? People like her want locking up. Who does she think she is, sauntering into my home like this, thinking she knows what she's talking about? How presumptuous of her! How completely arrogant!
I knew my father was really pent up, so I quickly retired to bed, feeling very certain my dad was going to drown his sorrows in a 6-pack of beers while he watched the sports channel. If he got drunk, it would not be my mother he would be bitching about this time, but the well-meaning Miss Campbell. As I retired to bed that night, it did cause me to reflect on how we were always moving around the place. Maybe my father was running away from something, but what? I couldn't imagine. A day or so passed, and then my father was up to his age-old tricks again. I literally wanted to scream. I knew what this was all about. We were moving again. I could feel it in my guts. My father's square jaw was clenched. He was running his large hands through his hair.
We're moving, Lydia.
Please, no, Dad. I really love this place. The school here is amazing. I've met so many lovely people here. I really like Anchor Marsdale. She's my best friend. And as for Miss Campbell, well, she's the best teacher I've ever had.
Well, that's a matter of opinion, my father had said. Your teacher, Miss Campbell, is a very disagreeable woman. Who does she think she is, interfering in our lives like this?
So we're leaving because of Miss Campbell, I asked him.
No, we're not moving because of your teacher. We're moving because I'm tired of this place.
Oh, no, I groaned. Please, Dad, I really like it here.
I have decided, Lydia dear, that maybe your teacher, Miss Campbell, had a point about us moving around so frequently. So I found a very beguiling place for us to live. A place I think you're going to like very much indeed. In fact, I think you're going to love it. I've been looking at all the pictures of the place. Would you like to see them? No, I said. Dad, I wouldn't like to see them. I told you, I don't want to leave. I like this town. I like the people here. I knew my words had fallen on deaf ears. It would only be a matter of time before we arrived at our new destination.
So there we were, out on the open road again, travelling to pastures new. My heart felt downcast, disappointed, and despondent. I was in no doubt that this place would be uninspiring. Once again my father had tired of it. We would move away again. I was sure of it, although he had assured me that we were going to lay down roots in this new place. But I was filled with cynicism, doubt, and scepticism, as my father had never been settled a single day in his life. Still, time would tell whether he would remain true to his word. We were driving past high embankments scattered liberally with trees, down quaint country roads, long forgotten by road repairs, for the tarmac that once was a road had forgotten its purpose, as most of it had been taken over by a sea of turf and rambunctious weeds, not afraid to completely monopolise the road with its unruly growth. Unfortunately, the road was not terribly kind to us, as pebbles pelted and pinged against the underbonnet of our truck. Suddenly in my belly I felt a strange fluttering and stirring of excitement, for we were journeying down rugged, remote countryside. So I soon discerned that we were going somewhere different this time, and indeed we were. We arrived at a farm gate in an area of North Carolina way off the beaten track, literally in the middle of nowhere. The name on the large cattle gate was Skyfield Heights. We drove past a symmetrical white farmhouse that was as pretty as a picture, with a few barns, stable blocks, meadows where black and bay and grey horses happily frolicked in a field. Finally we took a neat turning in the road, driving down a gravel path towards a tiny little cottage with a sign that said Ivy Cottage. I gasped in amazement. We were really going to be living here. "Are you sure we're going to live here?" I asked my father, dancing up and down with an ebullient joy.
"We are," said my father, taking me into his arms in an affectionate hug.
"But where is the nearest school? It must be miles away."
"You're not going to school," my father announced. "I'm going to homeschool you here at the cottage myself. The farmhouse you saw belongs to a farmer who's hired me to live on the land and help him on the farm. This is his cottage which we are going to live in. He says you're very welcome to ride his horses. So yes, we have settled here permanently."
"Really? That's amazing," I said. I had underestimated that word amazing quite considerably, for living in this remote country area, surrounded by viridescent green trees, pretty flowering meadows, rocky outcrops, quaint gravel roads, was really a life-changing experience for me and my father. He had befriended the congenial farmer, so I was permitted to ride one of their black and bay horses regularly in the countryside. I felt much more settled in my life, and homeschooling was working very well for me. My father would regularly take weekly trips to the local town to stock up on supplies, and for once the steady pace of life rolled smoothly. I began to feel settled in every area of my life. Several long months went by, and I couldn't remember a time when I was happier. Me and my father were getting on famously, better than we ever had in the past. My father seemed so much more relaxed and carefree, almost as if the weight of the world had been lifted off his shoulders. These days he barely ever got drunk, as the rich sweetness of the country air, along with the general maintenance work he did for the farmer, enabled him to sleep like he'd never slept before. Our health flourished as the stresses of modern life simply withered away, so the two of us were like wild flowers in the valley that blossomed more and more every day, for it seemed that country life nurtured and enveloped us with the wondrous warmth that the natural world embodied. One night, as I was lying fast asleep in my vintage bedroom, I was absolutely certain I'd heard something walking around our cottage. I woke with a start, feeling certain I wasn't mistaken. I'd never known Farmer Paddy to go walking around our cottage at the dead of night. But if it wasn't him, who was it? Farmer Paddy was a slender, willowy man, with a very light walk. But the person walking outside the cottage was definitely much more sizable, as the bipedal footsteps seemed to be rather heavy on the ground. I listened to the thumping sounds. Thump, thump, thump. I've always been incredibly curious and inquisitive by nature. I couldn't sit back in my bed without finding out what was going on around our cottage so late at night. I glanced briefly at the clock. It was 1:30 in the morning, very late. I pushed back the blue and white fleur-de-lis curtains. That was when I saw a dark, shadowy figure darting right past me, gliding swiftly into the woods. I was so astonished that all I could think was, what the hell was that? Imagine someone waving a huge black umbrella past you so fast that you wonder what it is that you saw flashing past your eyes. But you know you saw something. You weren't mistaken. I wasted no time in throwing on a pair of sneakers, along with a thick sweater, and of course my headlamp. I dashed out of the cottage at record speed. Not for a moment did I think of my own personal safety. I was far too impulsive for that. It was not too dark a night, I'm so glad to say. There was a full ivory moon in the sky, casting its silvery shadows over the countryside, dappling everything in an ethereal luminescence, while the twinkling stars bespeckled the sky in tiny clusters of quaint little glittering jewels tucked away in a black velvety ensemble. There was a slight chill in the air as I ran into the woods, while a faint breeze nuzzled my cheeks and blew some of my blonde locks into my eyes, which I pulled away from my face, fixing them firmly behind my ears. The tall, towering red maples, oaks and tulipola trees, with full heads of leafy green boughs, began to jiggle in the wind, while a faint stirring of excitement that I'd first felt when me and my dad had moved here began resurfacing in my guts all over again, almost as if hundreds of monarch butterflies were flapping away in my stomach. There was something about the ambience of the night that was evocative, stirring, mysterious, outer-worldly, and enigmatic. I'd never known the woods to feel like this before, as even the sounds of the crickets and frogs were strangely absent, so all I could hear was the whistling sound of the wind blowing through the trees, along with the distant howls of a coyote. It was when I entered the wood grove I could hear the strange chanting sound. It was very peculiar, very odd. I slowly moved towards that sound, until it became much louder. I don't know how to explain the chanting sound to you, only it was low-pitched and very deep, almost like some of those sounds you sometimes hear in meditational mantras. The sounds were very spiritual, deep, very moving. It truly stirred something inside me from a soul level, giving me the strange revelation that there was more to the substance of me than my physical casing. When I got close to the sound, I hid behind a tree trunk, switching off my light, but thankfully no one was paying attention to me. But I could see 8 creatures with hands linked together in a circle, heads bowed as though deep in prayer, repeating the same words again and again. I remember thinking, who are these beings? As the soft silvery flecks of moonlight cast shadows from the open canopy of the trees onto the creatures' bodies. I could see their outer humanoid silhouettes, but their features were a little fuzzy and blurred. All of a sudden a large male got to stand up in the middle of the circle. He spoke in a few words in a language I could not comprehend or decipher, but it sounded like an old indigenous ancient language, like the First Nations language. The imposing, impressive creature that stood up was enormous, but also wizened, sagacious and old, as if he'd been around for a considerably long period of time. His hair was heavily sprinkled with grey streaks that I secretly suspected was on account of his advancing years. I was stunned by how tall, wide and sinewy this creature was. I think he was possibly 8 foot tall, easily 700 pounds or more from a conservative estimate. All my attention was focused on the creature's human-like face. I don't know how to explain this to you, but this creature looked so wise, like an oracle you might seek out for spiritual guidance and direction, as if he had an infinite, all-knowing, unfathomable knowledge about anything and everything. I was transfixed and bedazzled by him, realizing immediately that he was a Bigfoot. I beheld a distinctive vaporous blue misty aura whirling around him, It made him look angelic. Everyone seated in that round circle seemed equally as enamoured by what he had to say, as if they were hanging on to his every word, as if every word was a precious jewel that was prized, honoured, esteemed, treasured and revered. Even I was mesmerised and in wondrous awe by his words. I didn't have a clue what he was saying, but his words rolled off his tongue like the ocean waves, smooth, crystal clear, authoritative. They grabbed your attention in a poignant way. It would be like if you were shopping in the supermarket. I imagine you always ignore the dull drawl as the background specials are being announced. But imagine you suddenly hear this voice. You hear this powerful, smooth, clear voice. It goes right through you like an invigorating wind. It stirs up your insides in such a poignant way. You stop and ponder. Who was that? Something in you knew that this was no ordinary voice. It was like that. You could be forgiven for believing that this was the voice of God, or one of his helper angels. I watched the ceremony for a good 20 minutes until it ended. Everyone bowed their heads, and then they got up and glided away, except for the old male, whose eyes were firmly fixed on the tree where I was hiding. And then he said, "May the Lord go with you, precious child, and take you under his wings." And then he nodded at me, and was gone faster than the lightning. It was only after this extraordinary event that I did my research and learnt more and more about Bigfoot. But this Bigfoot's face was so human, just like yours or mine, with the exception of a very flat nose and a heavily furrowed brow. None of the creatures looked ape-like, although their heads were pyramid-shaped and their arms overlong. I do not know if this was a coincidence, for I do not believe in coincidences personally, but only a day after my strange encounter with this incredulous beast, I was to meet my mother. Now I ask you, what were the chances of that happening? I remember it was late afternoon, veering towards 4 o'clock, and a truck drove down our driveway, parking outside of our cottage. I was chopping vegetables in the kitchen at the time. I saw the woman from the kitchen window, with her long black hair swept to one side of her long neck, which looked exotic like one of those Egyptian queens you see in pictures of ancient Egypt. I could imagine her wearing a royal diadem on her head. I noticed her golden-coloured face was very boyish. Her cheeks were full, her forehead sloped broadly, her nose ever so slightly hooked, and her eyes were dark. She was tall and slender, wearing a white dress with a slit up the front. I remember I almost cut my finger, wondering who this exotic woman could be. She slammed the door of her white SUV and walked very purposefully towards our front door. "Who is that?" said my father, who had been frying onions in a pan on the hob. He glanced out of the window. The colour drained from his face. "Lydia," he said to me in a stern voice, "go to your bedroom right now. I will get this." "But I haven't finished chopping the carrots yet," I protested. "Go to your room now, Lydia," my father ordered me. I went off to my bedroom, but I crept down the stairs and hid behind the curtain in the hallway to hear the conversation in the living room. "It's been a long time, Veronica," said my father once he'd opened the door to her. "I'm amazed you managed to find me." "Well, I did, and I have. You have no idea how tough these last few years have been for me, Neville. You think it's all right just to abscond with our daughter, to disappear into the sunset like that? How did you think that made me feel? You broke my heart." "You should have thought about that, Veronica, when you started threatening divorce. Do you think I was going to sit back and let you take Lydia from me? And have some unreasonable judge laying down the law of how many days a week I can see my daughter? No one was going to take my daughter away from me. No one." "You're so unreasonable, Neville. Don't you think we could have worked out a plan? Sat down like two civilised adults, discussed things in a civil way?" "No, I don't, Veronica, because you have never been civil a day in your life." "Well, more to the point, how is Lydia? I've missed her so much."
Lydia's doing just fine, thank you very much. No thanks to you, I might add.
No thanks to me? What the hell is that supposed to mean?
It means if you hadn't been so insistent about getting a divorce, nothing like this would have happened in the first place.
Oh, there you go again, turning this all around on me, Neville, when you were the one that abducted our child, not the other way round.
Oh, please, Veronica, stop being so dramatic. How can I abduct my own child?
Because you took her away from me, Neville. Don't you get it? You have no idea how many times I've got this close to finding you, and then you were gone. You were always one step ahead of me. It was so infuriating.
So what are you going to do now that you found me? File charges against me?
Nothing of the kind. What would be the point? You've already stolen most of my daughter's childhood. She's almost 14 now. I've missed out on so much. I'm living with a man and I have a 7-year-old boy and a 5-year-old. And I think it would be so nice for Lydia to meet her stepbrothers. Thanks to you, I never got married because you never even bothered to sign those divorce papers. Over the years, I've hired dozens of private detectives trying to find Lydia.
How did you find me then? Asked my father. I don't understand. We're in the middle of nowhere. I've left no paper trail behind me.
Even I can't answer that question. That's a conundrum for me as well. The odd thing is I found an envelope in my postbox with all your details, which is why I'm here.
But how is that possible? No one knows who I am or where we're staying. Never mind, you've found me now.
I'm not going to kick up a fuss, Neville. That would upset Lydia too much. The two of you, I imagine, have a great bond. But I want to get to know my daughter. I feel I have the right. It was at this point I came into the living room. My mother's eyes were fixed on me. Tears began to pour down her face. "Lydia, is that you?" she cried, dashing into my arms, holding me ever so tightly, while she began to rock me like a baby. "You have no idea, sweetheart, how I've longed for this day so very much. I got to a point in my life. I thought this day would never ever happen, that I'd never ever see you again. I can't believe that it's you, Lydia." "So you never wrote a note at 3 years old and abandoned me?" "Of course not, dear. You were my world. I've been looking for you for years. Now I've found you. I never want to let you go." To cut a long story short, being reunited with my mother was most certainly the best thing that had ever happened to me, and knowing that she had never abandoned me in the first place was so reassuring. I knew she had never stopped loving me, for she had never stopped searching for me. I did forgive my dad for running away with me. He was just frightened of losing me. But I'm glad to say me and my mother made up for lost time. I was to discover that I had 2 step-brothers, whom I love very much. Me and my father stayed at the farmhouse, but I regularly visited my mother and her new family over the weekends. I often wonder how it was that my mother got our address so randomly in the post, literally a day after my Bigfoot encounter. It was like everything in my life lifted after I encountered that anomalous Bigfoot. I often wonder whether the Bigfoots were praying that day. So there you are. That's my story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, most of us may have a secret of some kind, or we did at some point in time. I most certainly do, for if I was to share this secret, it would end up causing hurt to the people I love, which is why I would never share it with anyone. Sometimes we need to keep a secret for the greater good, to protect those we love from being hurt, offended, or even disappointed, either in us or in someone they know. It may be something we did in the past that brings us a measure of shame, self-recrimination, or even disgust. Perhaps we may feel somewhat demeaned, embarrassed and humiliated by our own indiscretions, so we choose not to share them with others. Maybe it's a skeleton in the cupboard we keep from our children, for if they knew how out of control we were when we were their age, they might use our secret as a weapon against us. "Well, Dad, I know you smoked weed when you were young. Why can't I?"
It might be an undisclosed secret that is so unfathomable, inexplicable, and inscrutable that if you were to share it with someone, they might think you were completely deranged or off your head. So it's in your best interest to reveal nothing to them, to keep your mouth tightly and firmly shut. The latter was the reason my grandfather sat on his secret for over 50 years, a secret that he chose to share with me one bright spring morning, an ordinary day that turned out to be extraordinary with his outlandish revelation. I remember at the time thinking, could this actually be true? There's no way this is true. But as my grandfather told me the story, his eyes clouded up with tears, his square jawline clenched, I knew then, without a shadow of a doubt, that this tragic, profound, esoteric story was indeed true. It was a personal story I was to tell my grandfather that enabled him to tell me his story. So sometimes when we share a secret all of our own, another secret that we may not have been privy to hearing may be manifested to us out of the blue, like a crab suddenly crawling out of its seashell. This was certainly the case with my grandfather's secret. Ironically, he told me this remarkable story on a day when the innocence of the new morning had just begun. It was a beautiful sunny day. The soft shafts of sunlight twinkled through the kitchen, casting their gentle shadows onto the flagstone floor. It would seem that as spring had made her presence known, the colder days had been hijacked by a change of season. Ostensibly, my grandfather's two Great Danes, Molly and Pluto, gobbled up this gorgeous sunlight with a thankful gratefulness as they strategically positioned their long bodies on the floor. Their short grey coats could absorb every drop of this sunshine with a ravenous appreciation. It had been a cold, hard winter, most especially the month of January, when keeping warm in the large farmhouse had almost been impossible to accomplish, as the large, open-plan, spacious rooms were never easy to heat. So me and my grandfather, along with the domesticated animal congregation in the house, had effortlessly gravitated towards the library. It was a small room, but generous, with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with quality hard books, some that are long since out of print, but made excellent reading material. The library was a resplendent, sumptuous, cosy room, painted in a deep vintage red colour, with a gleaming oakwood floor, a huge, magnificent Persian rug done in rich sequences of red and blues, a scattering of the most comfortable, durable white linen settees you've ever seen in your life, along with a very ornate, grandiose marble fireplace where my Gramps would light up the most sensational fires that would crackle away happily in the hearth, warming up the entire room so generously. It was hardly surprising that we loved that library so much, as nipping off to the other rooms in the house was rather like leaving behind the warmth of Hawaii and venturing boldly into sub-zero Arctic conditions, like the intrepid explorer, into the rest of the house. By all accounts, you could be forgiven for expecting to see a polar bear loitering around one of the other bedrooms, as that was how freezing cold the other rooms in my grandfather's house were. In a nutshell, it was hardly a surprise that in the library every member of our household, which included the two big fat tabby cats that had grown substantially oversized, not only from their regular feed, but by dining out on half the rat population in the outside barn, which they stealthily hunted during the twilight hours. The vet had looked at my grandfather disapprovingly when seeing the size of those cats' girths at their last appointment.
"I don't know what it is about American cat owners," he said dismissively, giving my Gramps a steely, rather judgmental look, "but we allow our cats' waistlines to get out of control. I regret to have to tell you this, Mr. Pennington, but both Oscar and Morris here are morbidly obese." He said that in such a solemn voice, as if he was telling my Gramps that his cats had a rampant form of cancer or only days left to live. "I assure you, Doc," my grandfather had told him, "my cats are on a reduced-calorie kibble diet, but they are feasting on the rats in my barn. That is what is making them very fat." I don't think the vet believed my Gramps, but it was definitely true, every word of it, without exaggeration. Needless to say, it was clear the vet did not believe a word of it. "Well, cut down on giving your cats treats, Mr. Pennington," he told my grandfather. "You need to be cruel to be kind. All too often cat owners give their cats a little sliver of chicken here
A piece of ham there, and it all adds up, and the calories get ludicrously out of control.
You're probably wondering why I was staying on my Gramps' farm alone. You would be right to ask that enigmatic question. I had moved into my grandfather's farmhouse, where I was to live with him exclusively for an entire year. A privilege and an honour that I delighted in, for my grandfather was my very best friend. We had always had a great connection. My grandmother, along with her best friend Nancy, my mother and father, were all going on a round-the-world trip for an entire year, on an exotic cruise liner. So while our family was out painting the world red, popping champagne on the equator, my Gramps and I were spending quality time together. My Gramps had no desire to globetrot. He wanted to man the fort, looking after the farmhouse he loved so much. I was being homeschooled at the farm, as I was 12 years old at the time. Suffice to say, my grandfather had lived on this farm all of his life, had grown up here himself as a young boy. It held for him so many wonderful nostalgic memories. I loved my Gramps' Colorado farmhouse, where he was involved in specialty ostrich farming, a whole new adventure that had been going remarkably well, as ostriches were easy to manage. Over recent years, thanks to people's increased and rising desire to improve their diets, there has been a huge interest in the lean, healthy meat an ostrich provides. But my Gramps also raises them for their feathers and their hide. Ostriches consume resources at a ratio far more profitable than cattle, so raising them was a no-brainer for my Gramps. But those birds can run for long distances, have a hell of a nasty kick, and drink a ton of water. My grandfather's farmhouse was an old colonial farmhouse with 2 stories and a wraparound porch, but all the rooms in the house were airy and big. The farmhouse was nestled in the middle of a valley, with a backdrop of undulating, billowing mountains that rose up under the cobalt blue sky like huge curvaceous giants, melting into this blue backdrop in swirling, sweeping folds of misty purple and blue vapour, so they looked hazy and obscure in the distance, but very dramatic and impressive for the eye to behold. Now that it was early spring, after the recent heavy rains, the farm looked like a sumptuous green park, while the silvery lake twinkled and gleamed in the noonday sun, and was heavily stocked with fish, flanked by large weeping willows with long feather-veined leaves that dangled above the water like viridescent feather boas. It was here that me and my Gramps did a lot of fishing together, a pastime that brought us a great deal of pleasure. There were a couple of cottages on the property that were sometimes rented out by people who were desirous to do a spot of fishing for themselves, and of course enjoy an extended break. You could describe my Gramps' property as botanical gardens with trees scattered liberally throughout the countryside, meadows that were fenced in for tall ostriches that ran across them with 2-toed legs. My favourite spot on my Gramps' land was a sprawling oasis or woodgrove, if you like, consisting primarily of tall statuesque bristle-toe pines, Douglas firs, Colorado blue spruces, mountain junipers, and narrow-leaf cottonwoods. It was a mixed wooded grove of varied tree species with precipitous mountain trails, rocky outcrops, a little stream that zigzagged through the woodgrove, thundering over the rocks with fast-flowing water. A spectacular haven, shall we say, for all kinds of indigenous wildlife, from foxes to mountain lions, elk, bighorn, sheep, bison, moose, and of course black bears. It was one night in early spring when I woke up in my grandfather's house to hear a strange roaring sound, a little like a lion, but a low pitch and frequency. I don't know why, but on this particular occasion it certainly aroused my attention. I wanted to find out exactly what it was, especially when I heard it again, as the noise was so bizarre. It was also in close proximity to our farmhouse. I guess you could say my ears perked up, rather like a dog's do. I could even hear the 2 Great Danes that slept in my Gramps' room let out a low growl. They had also heard the anomalous sound. I was naturally inquisitive by nature, not restrained by fear or bound by concerns over my own personal safety. At 12 years old, I didn't give those considerations a fleeting thought. I decided that the sounds, being an enigmatic oddity, warranted investigation, for if I didn't find out what the sound was, it would bother me indefinitely. I cautiously climbed out of the bed so as not to wake up my grandfather, although given his dogs had just growled, he might already be awake, I thought.
Beyond the low growls of his dogs, I could luckily hear my grandfather's heavy snores. I breathed a huge sigh of relief. Thankfully he hadn't woken up, for if he had, he might actively discourage me from going out of doors, something that adults are always inclined to do. I threw on a sweater and a pair of khaki pants, and of course sneakers, and I dashed down the staircase through to the kitchen. I grabbed a torch and made my way out of the back door, closing it behind me, but leaving it unlocked. I ventured vigilantly out into the tenebrous night. It was pitch black outside. I could barely even see the hands in front of my face without my torchlight. It was so dark, in fact, that I was ever grateful for the light of the torch. Everything was steeped in a velvety black darkness. The thin crescent moon seemed to cast faint shadows over the landscape. And as for the twinkling stars, they seemed dim by a slight mist. I suddenly heard the screaming sound again. I realized it was coming from the ostrich enclosure. I do know that male ostriches make a booming sound. Maybe that was the strange roaring noise I'd heard. It was rather peculiar, as I noticed that the normal nightly sounds of the crickets and frogs seemed absent, which was highly unusual, as I'd never known them not to entertain the night with their usual animated, jubilant song. Ostensibly, apart from the strange sound I had heard, everything was inauspiciously quiet. I moved cautiously towards a field of ostriches. I could see they were gathered together in a large, tight flock. They seemed fixated by something, their eyes pinned on a crouched, shadowy silhouette that was in the middle of the field. It looked like something 4 foot off the ground, that appeared wide, darker than the night. The mystifying, aberrant behaviour of the ostriches was very weird, incongruous and atypical for them. I'd never seen them so subdued, still and quiet, almost as if they were locked under some kind of peculiar, mesmerising trance. I crawled under the fence, darting from one tree to another. Finally, when I was close enough to the idiosyncratic figure in the field that beheld the ostrich's unmitigated attention, I spontaneously, in my heightened perplexity, cast the light of my torch on the figure. Then it stood up, proud and tall, turning around to look directly at me, its deep-set eyes giving off a red, menacing eye-shine. Whatever it was, it didn't like the light of my torch. For a moment my eyes were a little out of focus, trying to adjust to the light to see what it was. I gasped in horror as I realised that the creature standing up, with loose ostrich feathers in one hand and a deceased ostrich torso in another, was a Bigfoot. I think he'd been sitting in the middle of the field, plucking the ostrich feathers out of the torso. Possibly the strange noise was from the ostrich he had recently killed. I couldn't be sure about that. Until this moment in time, I hasten to say that I'd never ever perceived that Bigfoots were real. The creature scrunched up his eyes due to my torchlight, waving my light away from him, as if to say, "Stop shining your torch in my eyes. It's bothering me." The creature, standing up on 2 feet, was about 8 foot tall, 700 pounds. His hair was darker than the night, long and full. The creature looked at me, pulling back his thin lips, letting out the most terrifying roar that was very definitely personal. It was directed at me. He didn't want me ogling him in any way, like I was now. For a moment I didn't move, barely flinched even. Much like the ostriches, I seemed locked in a trance-like state. I found myself unable to react. I was frozen to the spot like a big, gormless, ineffacious lump of ice. It was only when the creature roared again that I jumped out of my skin and reacted, springing into action, where I began to hightail it back to the farmhouse, my adrenaline pumping through my veins speedily, my heart thundering in my ears. I was puffing, panting and gasping for breath. I could hear the Bigfoot pounding the ground behind me, almost as if he was chasing me. I was certain he was. His feet, when they hit the ground, were ponderous and heavy. I could hear his breathing, which sounded exactly like a horse. It felt as if he was a hair's breadth behind me, but when I turned around, he was thankfully gone. I think he just wanted to scare me off. All I know is that I raced into the kitchen, locked the door behind me, literally falling to the floor in an exhausted, deflated heap, while I tried to gather my composure, which seemed to have abandoned me. In my heightened state of shock, I was shaking like a jello, seemingly so impotent and powerless to gain any sense of calm perspective. My grandfather's 2 Great Danes were at the kitchen door, growling fiercely. They must have sensed or even smelt the Bigfoot. The next morning when I came down for breakfast, I could smell bacon permeating the kitchen, with its mouth-watering smoky aroma, as my Gramps was frying eggs and bacon over the range. I was hungry, that was for sure. "That smells yummy, Gramps," I said, wondering whether I should tell him about the previous night. Would he believe me if I told him I'd encountered a Bigfoot? I was sure he wouldn't. "Good," said my bemused Gramps, looking somewhat distracted and preoccupied, as if his thoughts were 100 miles away. "What's wrong, Gramps? You look slightly flustered and bewildered this morning." "Maybe it's because I am. I think bewildered is a very good word to use in the circumstances. Something has neatly plucked out the ostrich feathers of one of my birds. It would seem my injured ostrich, the one with the very bad limp, well, he was killed last night, but by what I cannot imagine. That's my big conundrum this morning. To all intensive purposes, the only creature possible of plucking ostrich feathers out of a bird this neatly has to be a man. Weirder still, the two long legs, the neck and beak, are lying neatly together along with the feathers. Now, if a wild cat had attacked that ostrich, it wouldn't leave the feathers, neck and legs in such a neat pile. Not possible. It couldn't do it. On the contrary, there would be feathers scattered everywhere. It is an enigmatic situation, to say the least." I flushed red, knowing that I had the answers to his enigmatic question, but I was reluctant to be forthcoming. Finally I piped, "Gramps, do you believe in Bigfoot?" My grandfather did not answer me. His brown eyes, that had been pinned on me for a moment, quickly darted away, as if he didn't want me to see his expression. I knew then, in that instant, that he had seen a Bigfoot before, so I immediately relaxed. "Well, Gramps, last night I heard a strange roaring sound like a lion, so I ventured out into the field. It was very dark out there, but I knew the screaming sound was coming from the ostrich enclosure. All the ostriches were behaving very strangely, as if they were under some kind of hypnotism or trance. They were gathered together in a large cluster, watching a large male Bigfoot plucking out the feathers from one of the birds. I shone the torch on him, which he did not like. He kept waving it away from me, crinkling up his eyes as if the light of my torch was hurting him, making him squint. He then roared at me aggressively. He chased me away from the enclosure. He scared the living daylights out of me, Gramps. I was terrified." "Well, he got rid of our injured ostrich for us, which isn't a bad thing. It was in terrible pain. I was in two minds about what to do with him. I was considering putting him out of his misery myself. His suffering has been immense, poor bird. Even the antibiotics prescribed by my vet were useless. I imagine the Bigfoot saw her. He saw she was injured, thought it would be a tasty meal." "You believe me, Gramps?" I said, astounded. "About the Bigfoot, I mean." "Oh, I believe you," said my Gramps. "Now you sit down. I will tell you a secret. I've never told anyone. It's a secret concerning a female Bigfoot, and it's a true story. But as other members of our family are out on a luxury cruise liner together, I will tell you a secret that I have never shared with anyone before." My heart began to flutter with excitement. "Does Granny know about this secret?" "Of course she doesn't, son. For if she did know, then it wouldn't be a secret, would it? This is a secret that I've only ever shared with you. Well, I'm about to anyway." This was the story my Gramps told me. "Growing up on this farm, I had one older sister called Meredith, and of course a younger brother called Keith." "A brother?" I said. "That's news to me. I didn't know you had a brother." "Well, you wouldn't have known him," said my Gramps regretfully. "He passed away long before you were born, when he was 18. He was a good-looking boy, like you, tall and lanky, with a full head of blonde hair, cornflower blue eyes. Growing up, all the young girls had their eyes on him. Can't blame them, really. He was a looker. It's not a subject that I care to discuss. It brings up all kinds of wistful, nostalgic and painful memories for me that I don't like to dwell on, as you can never fix what is broken, can you? Or go back in time to undo all the damage. For if you could, I would be there in a heartbeat. In fact, it was my brother's fortuitous death that made my parents move to the town and hand over the reins of this farm to me, so that I could manage everything on their behalf, which obviously I did. My parents were far too devastated about my brother's inexpedient, inopportune death to stay here on the farm. It quite literally knocked the stuffing out of them, as you can fully appreciate. So I took over at a very young, tender age, and went from cattle ranching to ostrich farming more recently. Quite a transition, even if I say so myself.
But that's so sad, Gramps. You never mentioned your brother to me before. Were you very close?
Yes, we were very close. Well, it's a subject the family never likes to talk about. It breaks open a lot of sorrowful wounds, naturally. Keith was a wonderful younger brother. He rarely was, only a couple of years younger than myself. Growing up, we would have so much fun together, the two of us. Sometimes we would help my grandfather with his cattle herd. Other times we would fish at the lake together, catch bass or catfish, which my mother would fillet superbly and pan-fry in butter, lemon, parsley and garlic. It would melt in the mouth like butter. It was so tender. Our favourite thing Keith and I enjoyed the most was to play cowboys and Indians together in the wood grove. Keith liked to be an Indian chief. He had an Indian headdress made out of eagle's feathers, whereas I had a cowboy hat. One day, me and my brother were riding our bikes down one of the precipitous trails in the wood grove. Then we propped our bicycles up against a couple of juniper trees in order to play cowboys and Indians. Keith was wearing his headdress, while I was wearing my black cowboy hat. Not much has changed, as you can see. My sister Meredith was at home helping my mother make strawberry jams and packets of vanilla fudge to sell at the school fete the following weekend. At first the forest was so congenial, so we played in this vibrant, all-embracing atmosphere. We could hear the happy chirrups, tweets, twitters and warbles of the birds. But then it became incredibly quiet and inauspicious. Indeed, it was so quiet and bodeful you could literally hear a pin drop. It was a very unnerving experience for us. The silence itself was disturbing. Granted, we could hear the water thundering over the rocks from the stream, but beyond that, everything was oppressively still. I remember getting this incongruous, irrational, baleful, rather threatening feeling that something was hiding in the dark shadows and watching us. I glanced up at my brother. His face had drained so white. He exclaimed that he'd seen a large black face staring at him from behind a tree. "You think it was a bear?" I asked him. He said, "No, it wasn't a bear. It was something hairy with a human face. It was looking at me. I know it was." I asked him to show me where he'd seen the face, but when I went to the tree in question, nothing was there. I was sure my brother had made up the image in his mind, due to the dancing ethereal light in the wood grove, that much like the fluffy clouds up in the sky, can certainly make you believe you saw something, when you really did not. The shadows in the dark forest can be exceedingly misleading, deceptive, and even ghostly. But all they are is shadows, nothing more or nothing less. That is what I assumed he'd seen, of course.
"But there was something there," he insisted. "I know what I saw. Please let's get out of here now, before something terrible happens." There was no doubt that the forest felt objectionably inauspicious, so I reluctantly agreed to call a halt to our game. But when we went to retrieve our bicycles, they had simply vanished. Lo and behold, we discovered our bicycles perched high up on a tree, over 12 feet off the ground. I could hardly believe it. I ask you, how does a bicycle get parked high up in a tree like that? Somehow we managed to bring them down, but something or someone had put them there in the tree. But who? My brother said to me, "I told you, that face wasn't in my imagination. It was that thing that was spying on us." Suffice to say, every time we would go to the resplendent, viridescent wood grove with our bikes, we found them later balancing high up precariously in the trees, sometimes wheel side up, which was awfully strange. We couldn't fathom what was going on, but my brother kept insisting that he could see a black, hairy, human-like face staring at him with twinkling eyes from behind a tree trunk, every time we went out into the woods. But I never saw it. I thought he was making the whole thing up. But my brother was not inclined to make up fictitious stories, so I was between a rock and a hard place in wondering what it is that I should believe. I would challenge him tirelessly, exclaiming that his imagination was in overdrive. He was making up faces in his mind. but he insisted he was not. "Why do we both feel we're being watched?" he would exclaim. "Do you suppose that's our quick-witted, inventive imaginations making all the stuff up? No, I think not. And then what about our bikes? Something keeps putting them up high in the tree." I told him that there had to be an alternative explanation for the peculiarity, that more than likely one of the farm employees was playing an expedient, misleading trick on us. But my brother was not convinced, as it happened every time, and he claimed that none of our farm hands had an ingenious sense of humour. My brother began to tell me that during the night in his bedroom, the same black face he saw in the woodgroves had been looking at him through his window at night. He would show me the smudges on his window pane the following morning. My brother never liked to draw his curtains, but he became increasingly rattled by the face that peered at him through the window almost every night. My mother would say, "Sweetheart, you're just like me. You and I are a lot alike. I've got a fertile imagination. I have lucid dreams all the time. I see things sometimes that are not there. You must have inherited that from me." "Then it happened," said my grandfather. "What happened?" I asked. "Well, one night after my brother had gone to sleep, the following morning we woke up to find the kitchen door had been left wide open, that my brother was no longer in his bed. My brother was 18 at the time, so my mother was very annoyed with him. Where had he gone? Why had he just randomly left without a by or leave? "So Keith got up early this morning, did he?" she complained. "Decided to leave the door wide open, did he? I woke up this morning to find half the chicken coop pecking around our kitchen. He knows better than to leave the door wide open like this. Even worse, he failed to make his bed this morning before he left, which is most unlike him. What on earth is going on with the boy?" As the weekend faded away, my mother became more and more indignant. She had heard that several people in Keith's form at school had gone camping. One of the mothers was convinced she had seen Keith among the boys, but she'd probably seen Dylan, as they were very alike, both those boys. My mother assumed Keith had gone off with them, failing to tell them where he was going, and she was more than a little peeved off. "Your brother should know better than to go camping without informing me. I didn't raise him to be so disrespectful, but of late he's been behaving atrociously. He should know better than to go swanning off like this, without telling me where he's going. If I didn't know where he was right now, I would be beside myself with worry. Thanks to Mrs. Mayer, I can actually sleep tonight, but no thanks to your brother." It was on Sunday night that Keith came running into my bedroom at 12 o'clock at night. The whole house was fast asleep, steeped in silence. He was shaking me violently. "Simon, get up! Simon, get up!" I groaned in annoyance, pulling the sheets over my head, but my brother persisted in shaking me. "You're back already," I said in surprise. "Mum and Dad aren't expecting you back yet until Monday night. Mum is jumping through hoops, she's so angry with you. She's incensed that you never told her about the camping trip. It was Mrs. Myers who told her where you were. She was almost having a coronary. Why are you back so early?" "What are you talking about?" said Keith. "I never went camping." I sat up with a start. "Well, then where the hell have you been? Mum nearly had a cadenza when you left the kitchen door wide open, inviting the entire hen population to poop all over her immaculate flagstone floor. She got really peeved that you failed to make your bed after you got up. So if you didn't go camping, then where have you been?" "It's all very weird," said Keith, looking at me with a stern expression on his face. "You know the black face that I kept seeing at the window, that I rarely kept telling you all about, that's been looking at me through the window pane night after night, that I always used to see in the woodgrove?" "The one in your imagination," I said sarcastically. "Well, what about it?" "I'm not making this up, bro. One minute I was there in my bedroom, looking at her, staring at me through the window, which she does every single night. The next thing I knew was I'd walked outside the house, through the back kitchen door. It was like I went straight out to meet her, in a hypnotic, trance-like state. When I came out of my stunned stupor, the creature had thrown me over her back. She was carrying me up this rocky elevation, quite a long way away from here, actually, but she moved so fast like the wind. Then I was in a sumptuous cave, which was surprisingly cosy. It had been swept clean, was generously lined with animal pelts, so that the floor was like a fabulous carpet. There were large woven baskets full of fruits there. I was lying on the straw bed covered with animal pelts. She was offering me berries to eat, some strange-looking roots and raw meat that looked rather like rabbit. A while later, a big male humanoid ape-like creature came into the cave.
He was astonished to see me in there. He stared at me in bewilderment with an agog expression. Then he began arguing with the female, pointing at me. She was screaming at him indignantly, stamping her foot like a petulant, spoilt brat, determined to get her way. Then sometimes she would shriek at him like a belligerent teenager, reacting adversely, in the duplicitous, guileful hope that a manipulative tantrum will make her parent concede. It was that kind of outrageous behaviour that she was exhibiting. The creatures were speaking the strange language together, with audible syllables backwards and forwards, but they spoke terribly fast. I knew I was the subject of a great argument. I was sensing the female was telling the big male she wanted to keep me as her mate. I distinctly got that impression. He was telling her that she certainly could not. I remember he spoke with a deep, smooth voice that was very authoritative, very determined. He kept giving me sideways, empathetic glances. His eyes were terribly kind, very intelligent. I got the distinct impression that his daughter, the one seemingly fixated by me, was always getting up to lots of mischief. I heard him saying in my mind, "Don't you worry. I'll get you back to safely when her back is turned away from you." The female would come up to me dotingly. She'd stroke my hair like a dog. It was exceedingly annoying. She kept bringing me food and gazing into my eyes adoringly, like a love-struck teenager. I could sense from her energy that she truly fancied me. "Are you winding me up? Is this all some kind of a crazy joke?" I asked my brother. "No, I'm being serious, bro. I couldn't make this stuff up if I tried. And regardless what Mum says, I don't actually have a good imagination. All those times we were in the woodgrove together, don't you remember? And I kept telling you about the black face I was seeing. She was showing her face to me, not to you. That was intentional on her part. She wanted me to be the one to see her. She had a crush on me for a long time, I think. She was the one putting our bicycles high up in the tree. And I think she was the one that stole Mum's missing fudge." "So what is she then?" I asked. "Well, she's human, isn't she? But she has ape-like influences to her appearance. But the creatures, whatever they are, appear to be big, powerful, muscular, intelligent, and they seem to have superpowers. I think they're some kind of primitive human being, although they do seem to have some extraordinary abilities. That female Bigfoot hypnotized me. She enabled me to leave my bedroom that night. I still don't know how she did it. It was like I was completely mesmerized under her spell." "So how did you get away from the cave?" I asked. "Well, the moment the female got distracted, the male grabbed me. He quickly threw me over his shoulders, brought me right back here. I tell you, bro, he was ever so nice to me, such a gentleman. He even apologized to me in my mind. He said he was sorry for what had happened, to accept his profusive apologies on behalf of his people, that his daughter is slightly off-centre, whatever that is supposed to mean." "Are you sure he spoke to you in your mind?" I asked. "Absolutely certain. I'm in no doubt about it." "You couldn't have made the words up in your head yourself?" I suggested. "No, I definitely didn't. I could hear another voice in my head, distinctly different to my own, just like I hear you speaking now. It wasn't my voice." "You are right, then. They must have rare qualities." "You mustn't tell the parents what happened to me. Promise me you won't, bro. They'd never believe me anyway." "Your secret's safe with me, bro. I hardly want to tell Mum you were abducted by a female ape-like humanoid. She'd think I'd lost leave of my senses, would she not?" The next morning when my mother saw my brother had returned, she jumped down his throat. "You're back, are you, Keith? Now, isn't that very nice?" she said, putting her hands on her hips and glaring at my brother defiantly. "You thought you could go swanning off on a camping adventure, did you? How very nice for you, without even telling us where you were going. What do you have to say for yourself, young man? I hope you're proud of yourself. To say that I'm grievously disappointed in your insubordinate behaviour is an understatement. I didn't raise you to be so thoughtlessly inconsiderate." "He's 18, said my father, leaping to Keith's defence. "Don't be so hard on him. He's allowed to be a little bit more independent, surely. He's old enough." "He's 18, but while he's living under our roof, he abides by our rules." "I'm sorry, Mum," said Keith. "I really didn't mean to be so thoughtless." "There, sweetheart," said my father. "He's given you an apology. Are you happy now?" "I'm still mad as a hatter," said my mother. "When you went out, Keith, in the middle of the night like a ghost, you failed to close the door behind you. My kitchen was inundated with our feathery friends. There was poop scattered everywhere. And if that wasn't bad enough, you never even bothered to make your bed. Sweetheart, said my father, you're coming down on Keith way too hard. He told you he was sorry. Whose side are you on, Philip? You're supposed to be my husband. We discipline our children together. I keep telling you, sweetheart, Keith is not a child anymore. He's 18. You're talking to him as if he's a 2-year-old. He's grown up now. He's not a baby. Well, that's because he's behaving like he's 2, said my mother. I'm sorry, Mum. I'll make it up to you, Keith assured her.
That night when we went to bed, I happened to sleep in the bedroom that was closest to the staircase, so I pretty much heard everything that went on downstairs. I could hear someone lumbering around as if they were walking in an uncoordinated way. At first I didn't pay any attention to the noise. I thought someone in a groggy, sleepy state had gone to the kitchen to get a glass of milk. I woke up with a start as I remember Keith had told me that the female Bigfoot had put him under a trance. He slept in the downstairs bedroom. I wondered if she had returned again to perform the same stunt on him and had somehow managed to hypnotize him. I dashed down the sweeping staircase to the kitchen. The door had been left wide open. Icy blasts of cold air were blowing through the opening of the door. That was when I saw the female Bigfoot with my brother. Of course, back then I didn't know she was a Bigfoot. It was in that revelatory moment that I realized my brother's stories about these humanoid apes had to be true. This creature was real. She was tall and huge with long flowing black hair, a pyramid-shaped head, and small pert breasts. She looked to be relatively young. All I know is that she was behaving like an irate woman. She began kicking furiously at my brother with her tree-trunk-sized legs that packed a powerful punch, seemingly oblivious to her own strength. My brother seemed to snap out of his hypnotic state. He was trying desperately to fight back, but it happened all too fast for even me to react. 1 minute the Bigfoot was kicking my brother. The next thing he was down on the ground, lying motionless. The Bigfoot tried to wake him up, but he lay there limp and unresponsive. She then let out a god-awful scream and glided away. My parents, on hearing the fitful scream, dashed down the staircase as quickly as they could in their pyjamas. My mother dashed over to Keith. She began to shake him violently to try and wake him up. But he was dead. They asked me what had happened, but I told them I'd heard a scream and found Keith like that. I could never tell them about the ape-like humanoid, for even if they did believe me, it would have distressed them too much. And besides, it would sound far-fetched and fanciful. So I didn't tell them what happened. But the coroner said he had a massive internal bleeding from a ruptured aorta, so he died very quickly. She said that my brother had been beaten with a powerful force. They concluded it must have been a bear attack, but my mother couldn't understand why my brother was lying dead on our front yard late at night. But my father suggested he went out to investigate a noise he must have heard, and probably encountered an angry bear. Wow, Gramps, that's an incredible story. I can't believe she actually killed your brother. Do you think she did so because if she couldn't have him, then she didn't want anyone else to have him? Well, it's a distinct possibility, isn't it? Said my grandfather. But then after she did kick him, she did appear to show some remorse. When she discovered he was dead, she let out a terrible scream. I think she was rather distressed about what she'd done. Perhaps she didn't know her own strength. Who knows what was going through her head? She was obviously furious he'd got away. That was obviously clear. Why are you telling me your secret? I asked my Gramps. I feel so privileged to hear it. Well, because you and I are here in this farmhouse for a whole year. It's a special time that we have together, is it not? While the rest of the family are sauntering around the globe. And you witnessed a Bigfoot yourself last night. And besides, when I go down to the grave, I think I would like someone to know my secret, especially my favourite grandson, like you. Needless to say, we never saw another Bigfoot again, but my Gramps is convinced they're still out there, but they remain elusively in the shadows. So there you are. That's my story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, Jennifer smiled at me warmly. She had become like an ineffaceable part of the family, with her regular visits to our farmhouse every single day. In truth, I was heartily grateful for her gregarious, vivacious and zestful presence around our home. She was so upbeat, high-spirited and positive, the kind of person who always sees the good side in everything, when things are invariably bleak, foreboding and very overcast. In my case, things were on a downhill turn. My life had spiraled out of control, with my wife's devastating diagnosis of pancreatic cancer. One moment she had been so well. The next minute she was confined to her bed and was receiving full-time hospice care from home, with 2 nurses who alternated in their duties. Jennifer worked as a daytime nurse, and Ella was her nighttime carer. My wife refused to be hospitalized. Who can blame her? "I don't care how long I've got left," she'd exclaimed. "That's not significant. But what I care about most is ending my life journey at home." Me and my wife had lived in this farmhouse for over 50 years. The farmhouse had been given to us as a gift from my wife's father when we first got married, as we'd both hankered after a rural way of life, and had never ever looked back. Ostensibly, I grew peanuts on my Georgian farm on the coastal plain south of the fall line, running from Columbus through to Macron and Augusta, where I was rotating peanuts with cottons, peas and sweet potatoes, which helps protect the plants from diseases, enhancing the nutrient content of the soil. Our business had boomed. I loved living in a rustic rural environment like this, where the sun beat down upon my brow, while a cool, invigorating breeze nuzzled my cheeks affectionately. I couldn't envisage a life where I was stuffed away in a cramped, confined office all day. As the Cherokee saying goes, "A man separated from nature becomes hard," of which I heartily agree. I couldn't put it more eloquently myself. Our charming, symmetrical white-brick farmhouse, with its imposing grey slate roof, was nestled in the heart of a beguiling valley, where on either side of the house were 2 statuesque oak trees that shaded the area with their umbrella-like branches. There was a sumptuous, perfectly manicured front and back lawn, dispersed with pretty perennial flower beds, along with an attractive rose garden, while the extended yard boasted a few pretty flowering bushes, along with a scattering of indigenous trees. The house had been modernized in recent years, so that the lower floor was comprised of floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked exquisite viridescent green views of the countryside. The house was hugged by a large wraparound porch with wooden decking and sumptuous outdoor furnishings. The upper floor of our house was more contained, with 3 medium-sized windows that emerged conspicuously or jutted out through the grey slate roof, with little roof coverings of their own over each window. You accessed our enchanting property through a large rusty iron gate, worn away from years of exposure to the elements, with a visible conspicuous carved sign that read "The Squirrel's Friend," which was the name for our peanut farm, which was very appropriate, as I ain't met a squirrel yet that didn't thoroughly enjoy eating peanuts. There were a fair few pilferaged every year by our furry friends, but our peanut production was so prolific it never presented a problem. Besides, I always made allowances for the wildlife, as I believe intrinsically in living in harmony with nature. You would follow a long asphalt driveway on our property, through an undulating, resplendent green valley that was perfectly aligned with neat rows of green peanut plants, and then you would drive past a large grove of peaches, a meadow with barns and stables where a few of our horses would frolic away happily under the pleasant warmth of the noonday sun. To the rear of our property was a splendiferous long-leaf pine forest that smelt of pine, with slender trunks that penciled up into the sky like sylph-like willowy giants, and amidst this sizable forest was a scattering of substantial mature oak trees. This sanctuary was an idyllic oasis for the indigenous wildlife, made all the more desirable by a fabulous stream that meandered through this valley, over some spectacular sculptural rocky outcrops. The woodland space had become my treasured sanctuary, now more than ever after my wife's devastating diagnosis. It was my quintessential escapism, if you like, where I would walk through the forest and try to allow the thoughts of my wife's illness to abandon my mind like a bird on the wind. I know that nature can sometimes be cruel and hard, but she can also be remarkably compassionate and empathetic, offering up the extravagant wonders of the natural world to you, rather like a king's banquet, upon which you can gratefully dine. So when I was in the woods, all my senses were stimulated, from my sense of smell to sound, and of course my visual appreciation. I would find I would return home renewed, invigorated, restored. It was something about the whispering trees, the crashing sounds of the water thundering over the rocks, that pacified me, soothed me, enabled me to find peace and solace. It's almost like the natural world wipes away your tears, gives you an inner strength that you never knew you had, that enables you to fight another day. Without those daily energizing walks in the woodgrove, I'm pretty certain I would have fallen apart a long time ago.
How's the patient doing? I asked Jennifer, who was making me a hot cup of tea in our country-style kitchen, with its cream range and more modern white granite countertops.
Alice is doing well today. It's one of her good days, I'm glad to say. But she's continually exhausted all the time. But then that is expected in the circumstances. That's the problem with cancer. It can be so draining. I sighed wearily.
I hate death. I can never get my head around it, even as a farmer. I think losing Alice is going to be a grueling ordeal for me. Watching her wasting away like this, withering like a flower in the meadows, is not easy.
Of course it's not easy, Hugh. It never is. Dying isn't easy, especially for the ones left behind, said Jennifer, reaching out to squeeze my arm encouragingly. But death is as much a part of life as birth. When I first got involved as a hospice nurse, it seemed such a daunting prospect, having to help a patient through the dying process, as we all react to it so differently, don't we? Some patients are so angry, they feel desperately cheated. Others accept their impending fate so gracefully, much like your wife Alice is doing. For me, becoming a hospice nurse happened by chance, actually. I was thrown into the deep end, as there was one nurse short at the hospice, so I was asked to fill in for the hospice on a temporary basis. You could say I was thrown in with the sharks into the deep end. I remember thinking, this is not what I signed up for. Actually, in truth, I felt really peeved off, as I didn't become a nurse to exit people from life, but to make them recover, to make them get better, of course. That was the whole idea of becoming a nurse, wasn't it? When I began working with dying patients, I realized what an incredible privilege it was to look after people on their last and final journey through life. These dying patients taught me a lot, I can tell you, Hugh. They made me appreciate the value of every single day. They made me begin to realize that sweating the small stuff is a complete waste of time. Now I would never want to return to regular nursing, not even for a moment. Working with the dying means I get to meet people like you, which is an absolute honour.
How old are you, Jennifer? I asked her.
I'm 35. Young, I know, for a hospice nurse, but I so enjoy my job.
Do you believe in life after death? I asked her. You can be straight with me. I won't take any offence. What I'm trying to say is that after Alice dies, do you think I'll ever see her again? Or do you think this is it? That's what I want to know.
You know, it's a funny thing. Until I worked with the dying, I didn't believe in God. I was of the opinion that if there was a God, why was there so much suffering in the world? I believed that once you died, it was all over. There was nothing more beyond that. My mother's seriously religious. She was frustrated with me about that, claiming that if I didn't believe in God, that my atheism would drive me to the gates of hell, where my soul would be damned for all eternity, that I would be left to burn within the fiery flames.
Oh dear, that's a bleak outlook indeed, I said.
Well, I didn't pay much attention to my mother's rambles. However, when I worked with dying patients, strange things began to happen that I couldn't ignore.
Like what?
Well, very often on the day the person that I was taking care of was going to die, they became, let's just say, compos mentos, when days before they'd been rarely out for the count. Often the patient would tell me that they were hungry. I would bring them something to eat. They would eat a lot. Then they would talk to their relatives. I was to later learn that this is known as the golden hour, where you can say your goodbyes to your loved ones. Many of my patients claimed to see deceased relatives that they said were picking them up to take them directly to heaven. If this had happened once, I would have called it a fluke. But it happened over and over and over and over again, countless hundreds of times. So yes, I'm inclined to think that the soul can never die. One of my friends, she's also a hospice nurse, I have to say, She physically saw an orb flying out of the patient's nose at the very moment of death. She emphatically believed she had a glimpse of the human soul. It was a sobering thought, as many say that the soul is in our brain, so then it would make sense if it exits through the nose.
Thank you, Jennifer. That makes me feel a whole lot better. I do like to think we live forever. Otherwise, what's the point in anything? Because life on this earth is far too short.
Well, I'm not saying all this to make you feel better, Hugh, Jennifer assured me. I'm telling you exactly what I know. My conclusion is that we don't die. So there we are, I've said it. And yes, I do think you'll see your wife again. In fact, I'm pretty certain you will.
Well, I'm going to reflect over this on a walk, I told Jennifer. I'm going into the wood grove. It helps me to relax.
Good for you. It's a very good idea. Take as long as you like, Hugh. Your wife is in my safe hands. She'll probably be needing a wee bit more morphine. I'll read her a story. That tends to calm her down. Helps her to sleep like a baby, it does.
Oh, I'm in no doubt, Jennifer, that she's in the very best hands under your charge, I said, giving her a mischievous wink.
I was so appreciative for her amiable vitality in our home. She made us laugh so much with her quirky, generous sense of humour. It had made the dying process a whole lot more uncomplicated and less dauntingly oppressive. I began my daily walk towards the woodgrove. It was a beautiful day, the kind of day that is so radiant that it's hard to imagine that there is anything bad going on in the world. I breathed in the fresh air, sipping it gratefully as it renewed my hope, restored my languishing strength. Somehow being close to nature helped me expunge all the current challenges in my life, lay them to rest without dwelling on them too much. As I entered the woodgrove, a bright little squirrel with large brown eyes watched me curiously as he nibbled away on an acorn. I was amazed by how tame he appeared. For a moment I stood still, rather like a marble statue, staring at the little creature. Finally he dashed up a branch and was gone from my sight. I could hear the pleasing chirrups, tweets, whistles and warbles of the bird's song. This enchanting sound tranquilized, mollified, soothed my troubled soul, rather like a band-aid on an inflamed, open wound. I smiled happily as a flock of rather social quails swept through the leaf litter on the ground with sideways movements. Then I could hear the crashing sound of the water thundering majestically over the rocks. I sat down on a large voluptuous boulder on the water's edge, paddling my feet into the water. I began to skim a few pebbles across it, something I'd done a lot as a boy. I often would wish as I threw a stone, rather like throwing a coin in the Trevi fountain in Italy. My mind was not short of wishes. These wishes of mine, without exception, were big. "Feel better?" asked Jennifer, after I returned from my walk in the woods. "You seem to be positively glowing. I can see the colours return to your cheeks. Come and see the patient. She's eager to see you."
"I do feel much better," I admitted. "It's being outdoors in the fresh air. It does you a world of good."
I entered my wife's bedroom. She was sitting upright against several puffed-up pink floral pillows, smiling at me brightly, like the warm sunshine. For a fleeting second she looked so much like her old self. You could be forgiven for believing she wasn't dying at all. How I wished that was true, and that my wish at the water's edge could come to pass. But wishes were like whispers on the wind. Still one can dream, hang on to hope.
"How are you doing, sweetheart?" I said to my wife, giving her a large, affectionate kiss on the cheeks.
"I'm feeling quite good today, actually. You're not looking bad yourself, sweetheart," she said, taking my hand in hers. "Now you listen to me, and you listen good. I may be dying, but this does not mean you should stop living. You hear that? I want you to live every single day to the fullest. Grieving is a waste of time. Being sad is so pointless, it's futile."
"You're right, sweetheart," I said, stroking her hand. "It's difficult to be happy, though, when I know you're in pain."
"Nonsense! My pain is being managed perfectly. Jennifer's doing a sterling job, so don't you worry your head about that." That evening the night nurse Ella arrived to take care of my wife for night duty. I sat up in the living room to watch some light-hearted television. Then I retired to bed. I woke up later that night, sweating profusely,
I was having a distressing nightmare about my wife's impending death. Hence, I couldn't sleep easily at all. I was restlessly tossing and turning. I quickly climbed out of bed. I started pacing up and down the bedroom, rather like a frustrated animal in a zoo enclosure. I thought I was coming to terms with my wife's death, but now I wasn't quite so sure about that. It was apparent that the idea of being widowed had hit me hard like a brick to the head. It appeared to be haunting my most lucid nightmares. I glanced at the clock. It was 12:30 at night. I couldn't get any sleep. The turbulent, fretful restlessness I felt was all-consuming. It monopolized my every thought. There really was no point in going back to bed. Then I had an inspirational idea. Why not take a leisurely walk in the woodgrove? So what if it was late at night, I thought. Why should that matter in the slightest? On the contrary, it could be fun. It would be far better than twiddling my thumbs with an unrestful insomnia, desperately battling to get some quality sleep that would elude me. I grabbed my rifle, threw on some warm clothes, put on a headlamp and ventured out of doors. Funny enough, I could feel an exhilarating thump in my heart as an excited flurry began whisking through my body like white fluffy meringues. I'm not sure I can remember the last time I actually took a walk at night. I could already feel my agitated tension lifting off me like a hot air balloon sailing away in the wind, floating up into the fluffy white clouds. By all accounts, it was a fabulously beautiful night, with a cool breeze blowing. It would seem the gentle, invigorating, stirring air revitalized and uplifted me, especially since moments before I'd been soaked in the heat of my own sweat. I glanced up at the vast firmament, lost in the marvellous wonder of the silvery clusters of stars that adorned the sky like sparkling diamonds, while an almost full moon dappled the night with a gentle, silvery, ethereal light that cast its soft shadows on the fauna and fauna. As I embarked upon my journey or adventure into the woodgrove, I was welcomed by the animated, cheerful chorus of the crickets and frogs, the hoots of owls, the occasional yapping sounds of neighbourhood dogs. I disturbed about 6 raccoons on the run that scattered the moment they saw me. I wondered if they would have done the same if my wife had been here. Probably not. I'm almost certain they would have recognised her. I smiled as over the years my wife had enjoyed feeding the raccoons. She adored their distinctive black patches on their eyes that made them look like mischievous rascals or black-eyed bandits that were up to no good. My wife had successfully tamed some of those raccoons that had been eating out of her hands for many long years. These little buggers took one look at me and decided they needed to abscond from my presence, bulleting away through the forest faster than grease lightning. As I walked, I could hear the crashing sound of the water thrashing and colliding viciously over the rocks. Then the sound of the night seemed to mute. The crickets and frogs stopped singing, almost as if they were holding their breaths for a moment. It was as if someone had intentionally switched off the background music for a brief reprieve or interval, if you like. In a trice, things became inauspiciously quiet, with, of course, the exception of the water that continued to make its thunderous assault over the rocks, with no respite. I could see the wind had picked up its unrelenting speed as it whistled through the tall, long-leafed pines. They jiggled their needled boughs furiously, as if engaged in the quick-step ballroom dance. Their swift swinging movements seemed baleful and menacing, almost as if the trees themselves, if they didn't happen to be anchored in the ground and stationary, they themselves would choose to eagerly run away in trepidation from this ominous night. An ill-boding premonition seized me like a quick warning squeeze or nudge on the shoulders, giving me the distinct impression that a predator was loitering in the dark shadows. That was when I heard the blood-curdling screams that sent the fear of God coursing through my veins like a hunter's hot bullet searing through flesh. It sounded as if a woman was screaming out in agonizing pain as she was being savagely murdered. Not to put too fine a point on it, I didn't hesitate to run towards the direful, unearthly noise, for I was driven by a desperate yearning, a need to rescue this woman that was being hurt. I'd visions of some deranged, unhinged man trying to bludgeon his wife to death in our woodgrove,
thinking that he could get away with the grisly murder in some remote forest where he was unlikely to be seen or heard. This would not be the first nor the last time that such a nefarious, duplicitous crime had occurred in our forest. 3 years prior, in our wood grove, a man had killed his wife here. The whole area had been cordoned off with crime scene tape. I had been alerted to the scene when I had heard the horrifying screams from the woman. I had run to her help, while her husband had absconded in his truck, with me running behind him, firing random shots after him. But to no avail. He had got away, but luckily not for long. The police finally caught up with him in the end. When I arrived to check on the poor woman, she was long since deceased, although her body was still warm. It had been a harrowing experience for me, one that had haunted me and my wife for quite some time.
You never come to terms with an event like that, do you? We were to learn that the husband had secretly witnessed his wife in bed with her lover. He had not confronted her with his knowledge of her infidelity, but had deliberately made his presence known in the house with his booming voice, so that his wife's lover escaped naked from her bedroom porch to the street. He then suggested to his wife they go for a quiet, peaceful drive in the countryside together, along with a leisurely walk that involved a wee bit of trespassing. But then why not? Such was the insatiable fury of the woman's aggrieved husband, who was so filled with an incandescent rage that forgiveness was estranged from him and knew no welcome in his heart. So he cunningly lured his defensive, ignorant, naive wife, like a lamb to the slaughter, out of his truck. In haste, without any application of second thought, and no willingness to engage in regret, the husband shot his wife of 20 years at point-blank range to extract his ultimate revenge. His fury was out of control. It could not be calmed, pacified, or subdued. Now it was happening all over again. The signs were written on the wind like invisible words. I could feel the familiar anger coursing through my veins. I was determined this time the man would not escape in his truck like he had before, whoever he was. In my mind's eye, this insidious event from 3 years prior was now replaying its malignant, acrimonious tune in my life all over again. But this time things would be different, very different. I promptly decided that if needs must, I would shoot the man in order to save the impuissant, poor, defenceless woman. Something instinctively made me slow down as I drew very close to the screaming woman. Perhaps I was secretly concerned that the irate husband would turn his rifle upon me, for there is no telling what a man will do when his sanity and sense has evaded him. I surreptitiously went to hide behind the large stump of an old oak tree, where I could study the proceedings with a judicious assessment. But what I saw made me recoil in horror. There were 2 female creatures engaged in an antagonistic, aggressive brawl. This was not what I'd envisaged seeing. I'm not sure exactly what they were fighting over, possibly a male. Who knows? I knew at once what these creatures were. They were both Bigfoot, but this was an unfair fight in every single regard. It was like David fighting Goliath, as the one creature looked startlingly like an ape in her facial features. She was easily over 9 foot tall, 800 pounds, covered in a tawny brown-coloured hair, with large pillowy breasts that hung low upon her chests like 2 wilting, sagging pawpaws, and with eyes as red as blazing traffic lights. The other creature was about 7 foot tall and 500 pounds, and although she was impressively large, she was dwarfed by this creature. Imagine my astonishment when I discovered her face appeared to be so human, her deep-set eyes dark, intelligent, and kind. In my humble, wizened opinion, I was watching a Herculean, hairy ape-man fighting a hairy wild woman. That is what seemed to be happening, although they were both unequivocally Bigfoot. I stood there watching this enigmatic fight unfold before my eyes, like a movie director assessing a clip in an esoteric movie. But this was real. I was pontificating, speculating what kind of course of action I should take. Should I intercede, or should I not? I had huge reservations, for this 9-foot ape-like creature looked volatile, treacherously dangerous. I wouldn't hesitate to suggest that if I fired at her, she would seize me in a second without flinching, before I could shoot her again. I would be viciously killed with one strike of her mighty hand that was as forceful as a garden trowel. I was in no doubt about that. I stood there like a spectator watching a blood sport, when in bygone times people came to watch a fight to the death with cockfighting or dogs. I could feel my heart racing through my chest violently. I could discern every single beat, while an incongruous icy cold sweat began to trail down my face, like slow raindrops dribbling down a glass pane. The large ape-like humanoid was screaming like a banshee, an ear-piercing sound that would make glass shatter, it was so discomposing. She was pouncing on the smaller Bigfoot, using her large, powerful feet, lunging with her legs. She lifted those legs to chest level, using them like deadly weapons. She managed to get the wild woman on the ground. She was hitting at her with her powerful, forceful thrusts, using her feet all the time. She managed to cause open wounds on the little Bigfoot. The Bigfoot was physically bleeding. The wild woman whimpered. Everything went deadly quiet. The huge ape-like creature kicked the wild woman one more time to see if she would move. She didn't react. All was still. Once satisfied that her foe was indeed dead, the large ape-like Bigfoot glided away. She disappeared into the heart of the forest, leaving behind a ghastly stench that reminded me of sulphur. I immediately ran up to the lump of bloodied hair lying on the ground, feeling certain that this Bigfoot was dead, beyond my help. A small part of me wished I had possessed the courage to shoot at that nasty large Bigfoot, but an overwhelming terror had seized control over my ability to react, rendering me helpless and inefficacious in every regard. I ran over to the Bigfoot, my heart sinking, realizing to my astonishment that the creature was still alive, but blood was pouring profusely out of her leg at an alarming rate. It didn't look good. The prognosis was bleak. I knew if I didn't stop the bleeding, she would be dead in seconds, literally seconds. Those kind of injuries are notoriously fatal, without efficient, super-fast intervention. It was fortunate, as before I ever met my wife, I had done a short stint as an EMT on the beat, so I knew a thing or two about first aid and prompt application. I tore my shirt and made a tourniquet to stop the bleeding. I then managed to get my ATV to the scene, using a drag chain and plastic torp to roll the creature onto it, which I managed to drag back home. How I did this I am not sure, but against all odds, with a great deal of heavy breathing, I managed to get a badly injured Bigfoot back to my farmhouse in one piece. Ella, the nurse on duty taking care of my wife, helped me to drag the torp into the downstairs bedroom, where we rolled the creature onto one of those pop-up double mattresses low on the floor. But the Bigfoot helped us maneuver her, even though she was very out of it all. The nurse didn't ask me any awkward questions. She just went to work efficiently and quickly like a pro. She disinfected the creature's wounds, administering first aid, stitching up open wounds to stop bleeding, and giving the creature medication and painkillers. She knew exactly what she was doing. She'd worked in accident and emergency for 10 long years before, eventually branching out into hospice care. Once the Bigfoot was stable and heavily sedated, Ella asked me hundreds of questions, none of which I could answer. "You found a Bigfoot? That's extraordinary. What happened?" "Well, I went for a walk in the wood grove. I heard a woman screaming. I thought she was being murdered by an aggrieved husband. It's happened here before on our land. So I ran to the scene at once, but I was very cautious when I got up close to the commotion, in case the husband was inebriated or off his head. You do have to be cautious in this regard. When I arrived on the scene, let's just say I was gobsmacked. There is no other word to use. It was two Bigfoot fighting each other, but they were strikingly different. So different, like a dog is from a cat. One looked like a huge human-like ape, the other one like a wild woman. The Bigfoot looked like he wanted to kill the wild woman. "Really? That's extraordinary," said Ella reflectively. "You don't suppose they might have different species, do you? The one we have here is so human-looking." "Wow, I never thought about that. I suppose that would make a lot of sense. The ape-like Bigfoot was as mean as hell. Never seen such a nasty-looking face. I think she believed this Bigfoot was dead,
as the Bigfoot didn't even flinch when she kicked her.
Clever girl. Maybe she played dead. That's what I would do in a situation like that, when I'm being overpowered and subdued by an oppressor. By all accounts, these creatures are remarkably clever. Let's face it, if they've managed to avoid our detection for years and years. Up until now, I personally never knew Bigfoots were real.
Neither did I. But more to the point, do you think the creature is going to be all right?
Well, there's a good chance, isn't there? That she'll be fine thanks to you. If you hadn't applied the tourniquet to the femoral artery here on the upper thigh, close to the groin, she would have bled out so fast and almost certainly died. So if she pulls through, it's thanks to you. I will say this, though. She's been beaten up rather badly, but I can see her body is much more robust than ours is, so she could recuperate rather well. A creature like this with such an awesome build is inclined to be much more resilient. If she was a 170-pound human being with these kind of injuries, she would definitely be dead.
I need to ask you a favour, Ella. You can't breathe a word of this to anyone.
As if, said Ella, raising a brow. I want this Bigfoot to get better. Do you think I'm going to go around telling people we're nursing a Bigfoot? It's a guarantee that this Bigfoot would never recover if that was the case, so you can be assured of my discretion. I won't tell anybody about it even after the creature's healed. In the days that followed, with the sagacious help of Jennifer during the day, and Ella at night, the Bigfoot female was well on the way to recovering. I remember the first time she opened her deep-set dark eyes. She looked up at me. She was bewildered and surprised that she was still alive. She lifted the sheet that was covering her body to examine her wounds. She pointed to me, and then at her wounds, as if to say, "Did you help me?"
Yes, I said. I saw the fight. I put a tourniquet onto your wound to stop the bleeding.
I pulled the sheet back to demonstrate to her exactly what I meant. She nodded and looked up at me with the kindest, most beautiful, appreciative, deep-set dark eyes that I've ever seen, that were so full of gratitude. I marvelled at how intelligent she was. She admitted to me that she had played dead when the creature had been attacking her. I handed her a book of paper and a pencil, and through a series of drawings I deduced why the fight had occurred in the first place. From what I could discern or deduce from my interaction with this female Bigfoot that was recuperating under my roof, is that Bigfoots that have ape-like facial features readily despise those that look very human. They feel intimidated and threatened by those that have more human-like features, for the human-looking Bigfoots are far superior in their intelligence. They are peace-loving and gentle, always eager to help those in trouble. But those that look more like apes, usually with bright red eyes, are violent and aggressive. Over many generations, the different Bigfoot species have been at war with each other. Many of the ape-like Bigfoot males have notoriously tried to abduct Bigfoot females that look human in order to procreate with them, as they found them attractive and would like to procure more human-like features in their rudimentary, crude DNA. Failing that, they've tried to abduct human women with less success. The female Bigfoot who told me her name was Ayana, which means eternal blossom, told me in a series of drawings that the female Bigfoot that had tried to kill her had her sights set on a big strapping male in her tribe, whom had made no secret that he was interested in abducting Ayana to make her his wife so that she could birth his offspring. The female Bigfoot was determined to eliminate the competition. This would mean she could seduce the Bigfoot male in her clan for herself with a greater chance of success. It would seem she would stop at nothing to attain her goal, even if it meant killing Ayana, which is exactly what she tried to do. Over the next few days, Ayana got stronger and stronger. My wife was always asking about her. When I told her I'd saved the Bigfoot's life, she was thrilled. I explained that Ayana had been embroiled in a fight with a dangerous Bigfoot female, as the big male she wanted for herself had his sights set on Ayana. The Bigfoot female had tried to kill Ayana, in the hope that the male would turn his attentions upon her. "That's most unfortunate," my wife piped. "What happens if the Bigfoot female discovers that Ayana did not die? Surely she'll come after her again, try and kill her. It would seem her heart is set on the male in her clan. She will eliminate all the female competition until she gets her man." I tried to explain my wife's misgivings to Ayana about how when she was fully recovered, the female would try and kill her again. But Ayana assured me that she would join another Bigfoot clan, who were human-like her, but lived much further afield, in order to escape her jealous oppressor. It was after a week of rest and feeding up the Bigfoot with plenty of fruit and peanut butter sandwiches that she loved that she was to make a full recovery. She indicated that before she left, she wanted to sit down with my wife, as she had learnt about my wife's illness. My wife was fast asleep when Aiana entered the room, but she sat up and smiled when she saw the Bigfoot. "Hello, Aiana. My husband's told me all about you. I'm so thrilled to see you. I'm so glad you're better. Thank you so much for visiting me." Aiana sat at the end of her bed, looking lovingly at my wife with tender eyes, reaching out to hold her hand. I gasped when I saw my wife's hand in the Bigfoot's huge hands, as her hands looked like that of a tiny porcelain doll by contrast. I was amazed because although Aiana never said anything to my wife, the Bigfoot engaged with her in private telepathic conversation. I noticed my wife was profoundly moved emotionally by Aiana. She was nodding, her eyes filling with happy tears. She smiled joyfully. The Bigfoot nodded at me, touched me on the shoulders gently as if to say thank you for everything you've done for me. Then she indicated to me that she needed to go. She also patted Ella on the back. We led her to our front door. She nodded at us one more time, her eyes filled with so much gratitude. We waved goodbye to her. We watched her gliding through the trees. I marvelled at her grace. It was hard to believe that she had ever been injured. She moved her legs with a seamless fluidity that made it appear as if she was floating on ice. It was now my turn to physically cry. Tears welled up in my eyes. I was surprised to see that Ella was crying too. That was how much this Bigfoot had moved the both of us.
"Not you as well," I said to Ella. "Look at us blubbing away like great big babies. Why are you crying?"
"Because," said Ella, "in all my years of nursing, I've never nursed such a grateful patient, and there was something about her presence that filled your home with such a warm, convivial energy, which your wife could feel before she even met the Bigfoot. It was such a privilege to nurse her back to health. When me and Ella went into my wife's bedroom, I asked my wife what the Bigfoot had said to her.
It seemed like she was speaking to you telepathically. What was she saying?"
My wife smiled. She was showing me pictures of heaven, the place I'll go to once I leave here, she said. I'll be going there next Tuesday, but not to be afraid, that's what she was telling me, because it's a very beautiful place. The Bigfoot was right on the money, for the following Tuesday my wife died peacefully in her sleep. So there you are. That's my story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, Mrs. Nettles lived next door to me in an old cottage-style home in a green leafy rural neighbourhood outside of Portland. She was in her late 80s, but was a sprightly, energetic woman that had been fit as a fiddle for as long as I'd known her. Over the years I'd waved at her over the fence in our backyard as she attended to her phenomenal rose garden. She would always wave to me joyfully with a full straw hat on her head and a pair of secateurs in her hand. We would engage in a few words together over the fence. "Lovely day, isn't it, dear?" she'd say to me. "I love getting out into the fresh air, especially on a fine day like this." Mrs. Nettles knew how to grow roses like no one I'd ever known, and she had hundreds of different roses clustered together in her yard, in purples, creams, pinks, violets, yellows, and believe it or not, she grew some black roses that were surprisingly really rather magnificent. I remember when she first handed me a few black roses, she watched my expression change from astonishment to delight. "They're black!" I'd exclaimed, "but they're so beautiful." "Don't be so surprised, dear," she had said. "Haven't you noticed that many stunning butterflies have black in their wings? It only serves to enhance their vibrant colours. And what about evening dresses and cocktail gowns? They look incredibly elegant in black." For a moment I'd reflected on Mrs. Nettles' words. "You're right," I said. "I often gravitate towards black for smart evening wear. I guess I've never considered you could get black roses before. But these, they're magnificent. Well, think about the night sky. If it wasn't black, the moon and the stars would not look nearly as scintillating." "Now there's a thought, Mrs. Nettles. You're 1,000% right about that. Those silvery stars would not be pronounced or conspicuous without a contrasting velvety black sky, would they?" "My point exactly," said Mrs. Nettles. "Think about all those black evening gowns with rhinestone jewels. They look amazing. Mrs. Nettles would regularly pop over to my house with a huge bunch of colourful roses for me every time, and often one of her homemade apple crumble pies that she was famous for making in our neighbourhood. I think she cooked the apples in a caramel sauce, which made it delectable. There are no words to describe how delicious it was. Mrs. Nettles had recently fractured her ankle while out doing gardening in the backyard. Since her nasty fortuitous fall, she was getting increasingly frail, so I tried to pop around to her house regularly whenever I could offer her a helping hand. After all, I lived next door. It was the least I could do in the circumstances. We lived in a fabulously leafy green neighbourhood, on a street with decently spaced back and front yards, with individualistic homes, most usually ranch style, that were close enough that people were on first-name terms with each other. Some of the properties were significantly bigger, where the owners may have had a stable block and kept 1 or 2 horses in a meadow at the back of their property. It was a congenial, companionable neighbourhood. Everyone knew each other, but you rarely felt that you were living in a rural, rustic community, where the air was so fresh. There was an abundance of trees and still more trees everywhere that you looked. It was not uncommon to see riders trotting down our street, to the bottom of our road, where a fabulous open clearing sprawled out into a plethora of woodland riding and hiking trails, pretty flowering meadows, fields of sagebrush, gravel pits, and an abundance of rocky outcrops. It was a spectacular, magical place, where many of the local residents would go for walks, sometimes on their own, other times with their dogs. It was in this tranquil nirvana that you forgot about your neighbourhood, only minutes away. As in this transfixing sanctuary, you felt as if you were in the middle of nowhere, alone with the sounds of birdsong, the sounds of moving water, the pièce de résistance being, of course, an exquisite waterfall, where you could watch ribbons of white water bounding down the precipitous rocky outcrops, where mesmerising white foaming bubbles would fold into the rock pools below, and zigzagged through its long course into the lower valley, until finally it amalgamated in a broad roaring stream, a quintessential favourite spot for fishing for many of the locals. Many in our neighbourhood, if they had a really bad day, they would naturally gravitate towards this waterfall. They'd sit on the embankment, sipping the sensational views, rather like drinking a glass of effervescent bubbling champagne. It had the same uplifting effects, with none of the side effects, for when they left this treasured oasis, it was like they abandoned their depression that had previously entwined their hearts with a bleak outlook. They returned home with a spring in their step and a smile upon their face. And, of course, nature herself had worked her magical medicine. Mrs. Nettles had given me a key to her front door, so I could always walk into her house unannounced. But I liked to cordially tap on the window to let her know that I was coming inside to her house. On this particular occasion, I didn't open the front door, but went through to the back, as she always had a habit of leaving her kitchen door unlocked, even late at night, as our neighbourhood was considered very safe. "Mrs. Nettles, it's me! Mrs. Nettles, it's me! I'm coming in now," I said, pushing open the kitchen door. Mrs. Nettles was sitting at her kitchen table, with a cup of what looked like over-cold tea in her hands. Her view from the kitchen window overlooked her prized rose garden. On this occasion she sat there frozen to the spot, like a mannequin doll, her unblinking eyes almost glazed over like a dead fish. I'm not going to lie to you. For one horrifying fleeting second, I thought Mrs. Nettles was dead. She didn't flinch, until I saw a lonely, isolated tear trail slowly down her pale white cheek. "Mrs. Nettles, are you all right?" I said, looking alarmed. I reached out for a tissue in the box and handed her one, which she took gratefully and bashfully wiped a tear away. "You scared me there for a moment, Mrs. Nettles. You were sitting there so still. Why are you so upset? Is everything all right?" "Oh, don't mind me, Lisa. You know me. I always overreact." "Renee Nettles, look at me. Nice try. You don't fool me for a single moment. I've never known you to ever overreact a day in your life. You, my dear, are one of the most level-headed people I've ever met. So tell me, why are you so upset? Is it your ankle? It's not giving you pain, is it?"
Oh, no, dear, nothing like that. It was my son Jonathan. He popped over last night. He had words with me, words I didn't want to hear. Really? That sounds ominous. What about? He thinks I should sell up and move away into an old age home. He keeps reminding me that I'm not getting any younger, and with this ankle injury, he keeps pointing out my inability to move around efficiently. That's very nice of him to point that out to you. From where I'm standing, despite your recent injury, you're as fit as a fiddle. Slower, perhaps, after you took that nasty tumble, but as sprightly as ever. Well, he's right, I mean. I have slowed down considerably, haven't I? It takes me twice as long to do everything. The shopping is a complete nightmare these days. Then cleaning the house, well, that's almost a non-starter. And as for the yard, I can't attend to the roses as frequently as I would like. It's really getting me down. I don't mind admitting it. But you can still move around easily, can you not? Of course, but... No buts, Rona. We help each other around here. I'm quite happy to do your shopping for you, help cook you a few meals, clean your house. My 3 sons will be able to help you with the roses in your backyard and the mowing of your lawn. You just tell them what to do and they'll do it. My boys are pretty handy with a trowel and a pair of secateurs, I'll have you know. I have them well trained. But I can't possibly ask you to stick your neck out for me like that. Why not, Rona? If the boot were on the other foot, you know you would do the very same for me. I know you love your home, and you want to stay here for as long as you can, and we'll do everything in our power to make that happen for you. You're not incapacitated, so there's no reason why you can't live here like you always have done. Being slow on your feet, well, that's insignificant. If you can still move around, then you don't need to go to an old age home. In fact, the very notion is ridiculous. You'll look like a teenager hanging around those old dears. Oh dear, I don't know what to say. I'd love to stay in my own home, Lisa. I really would. But I can't move around. It's the slowness after my injury that's a botheration. Well, that's why we're here, to help you. Jonathan's not going to be happy about that. He wants to put me in an old age home. He's most insistent about it, actually. Well, how often does Jonathan visit you, Rona? He lives far away, doesn't he? Yes, he does. I barely see him. I'm lucky if I get to see him 3 times a year. Well, Rona, don't let him bully you. I've never met your son, but I will say this. This is your house, and you can stay here as long as you like with our help and intervention. It's your call. I know you love this home, so you should live here as long as you like. I'd love to die here, actually, said Rona dreamily. I really would. Thank you, dear. I'm most grateful. You have no idea how much I will appreciate your help. Within days, Rona Nettles' life had significantly changed, as me and my husband and 3 sons, Paul 12, Michael 15, and Wayne 18, all drew up a roster to take it in turns to do our bit to help Rona with her shopping, cleaning, mowing the lawn, attending to her roses. I would take down Rona's shopping list and place the shopping in her cupboards. She would sit there pointing to the goods that I had purchased. The sugar goes in that white container over there marked sugar, that's right. The cereal goes into that Tupperware jar. One day I was putting her shopping away. There was a knock at Rona's front door. Give me a moment, dear. I'll go and get that for you. To my amazement, it was an estate agent. Hello, said the very debonair man standing in the doorway, who looked every part a real estate agent. He was wearing a formal blue suit, a shining pair of pointed black shoes that had been polished so brightly you could see your reflection in them. He was neatly shaven and smelt strongly of a very aromatic aftershave that reminded me of Curus, as my son used to use it a lot. He peered at me behind a very bland pair of glasses through his beady brown eyes. He swaggered like a tall, proud tree on a windy day, with the inflated look of an eager salesman who was already seeing dollar signs in his head, for there was no doubt that Rona Nettles' house was worth a bob or two, and the estate agent's flaring nostrils were smelling that printed money even as we spoke. He gave me a warm, confident smile, exposing a Hollywood set of whiter-than-white teeth, a winning smile that certainly must have cost a fortune from an excellent cosmetic dentist. My name is Jules Johnston. May I please come in? He said, shaking my hand warmly.
How had he done that, I wondered with annoyance. Somehow he'd masterfully manipulated his way into Rona's house. I found myself leading him into the kitchen. "Rona," I said, "this is Jules Johnston. He's an estate agent."
"Hello, Mrs. Nettles," said Jules, smiling at Rona brightly,
with a presumptuous familiarity that gave you the distinct impression he'd known her personally all his life.
"Your son, Jonathan Nettles, gave me a call."
He reached for the old woman's hands and gave it a firm shake.
"It's very good to meet you, Mrs. Nettles. Now, if you will allow me for a few moments to assess your home, I'll be back in a tick," he said. Then he was gone faster than lightning, sauntering through one room after another with a pen and paper, studying every space with a judicious look. "What's that about?" asked Rona, raising a brow. "I'm sorry, Rona. He masterfully manipulated his way into your home. I think your son Jonathan gave him a call, asked him to value your home." Rona sighed. "It's not your fault, dear. The man wormed his way in here masterfully. These professional types, they've got their sales figures down to a fine art." In what seemed like minutes, Jules the estate agent came sauntering into the kitchen with a huge beam on his face. Rona and I were seated around the kitchen table, drinking tea together. "I'm very pleased to inform you, Rona, that your house is in remarkably good condition. Sorry, I hope you don't mind me calling you by your first name."
"No, that's fine."
"I think with a few minor details attended to quickly, you could have your home on the market by next weekend. I notice some of your bulbs need replacing. I think that many of the skirting boards should be repainted with some white enamel. Then there is a tap in the cloakroom that needs replacing. There are a couple of floorboards in the upstairs room that should be re-sanded and polished. Other than that, we're very good to go. You say the word. I know a fabulous maintenance man that can attend to the jobs for you at a fair price. And then we're ready to stage your home."
"But I'm not selling," said Rona. "Not at the moment, that is." The estate agent's warm smile turned down into an upside-down frown.
"But I don't understand," he said, looking genuinely perplexed. "Your son Jonathan was most insistent you needed to sell immediately. The good news is that your house will be snapped up very quickly, should fetch a decent sum. I took the liberty," he said, fidgeting around in his briefcase and bringing out some brochures of retirement homes. He continued rather bashfully. "I took the liberty, as I was saying, of picking these up for you. Your son Jonathan requested for you to look at them, so you can decide which place tickles your boat, so to speak."
The estate agent straightened, took in a deep breath, handed Rona all the leaflets and his business cards.
"Just give me a call as soon as you decide to sell. I'll be here in a heartbeat. I'll show myself out, shall I?"
"Yes, please do." Rona sighed. "My son Jonathan, he's not easily fobbed off. He's hankering for me to sell this place." "Well, it's entirely up to you, Rona. But I think you should stay here as long as you can. This is your home, after all. We have a perfect roster that is working efficiently for you." That evening at about 6 o'clock, as I was bustling over the range preparing shepherd's pie for dinner, the bell of the front door rang. "Michael, will you answer that, sweetheart?" I heard my son talking to someone in the doorway. I heard him say, "Yes, she is home. Follow me." My son escorted a man in his late 50s into the kitchen. The expression on his face was enraged.
"Are you Mrs. Forrester?"
"I'm her, yes."
"Who do you think you are, telling my mother not to sell her property? My mother is an elderly woman in her 80s. She needs to move into an old age home forthwith. It's come to my attention that you are interfering into her personal business. The estate agent informed me that my mother has decided not to sell, and I gather it's down to you, her interfering neighbour. I know about your type, Mrs. Forrester. There's always one busybody in every single neighbourhood. Just my mother's luck to end up living next door to one. The nauseating type who puts her nose where it doesn't belong."
"Look, Mr. Nettles, You're Jonathan, I take it. Your mum's told me an awful lot about you, and your eagerness for her to sell her home. I assure you your mother doesn't want to sell yet. She can still manage around that house. Yes, she has slowed down after her ankle injury. But that's where we help her, with all her shopping, her housework and her yard work, and she's managing very well with our intervention.
Living on her own is not a good idea, but you're actively encouraging her to stay in a home where she could potentially have an accident.
Well, accidents can happen anywhere, Mr. Nettles, even in retirement and old age homes. I'll have you know your mother is still managing very well on her own. Besides, she adores her house. She wants to stay there as long as possible, and why not? If she had her way, she would die on that property.
I don't want her to stay there. I want her to move at once. It'll make me rest a lot better. I told you she's getting old.
That's rich coming from you, Mr. Nettles, if you don't mind my saying so. From a son who visits his mother 3 times a year if she's lucky. I happen to live next door to your mother. I'm her next door neighbour. I've known Rona for over 20 years now. We're incredibly good friends. We've always helped each other out in this neighbourhood. If your mother wants to move into an old age home, she'll do so in her own time and at her own pace, thank you very much. It's not for you to bully your mother around. She is still of sound mind, and she can make her own decisions. Why don't you speak to her about it yourself if it bothers you so much? I think you'll find she's made up her own mind.
You know I can't speak to my mother. She's as stubborn as an ox, refusing to sell, simply because you're helping her out. If you didn't interfere so much, none of this would be happening.
Look, Mr. Nettles, I appreciate your coming around, but I'd thank you to leave right now. I'm about to serve up dinner for the family. Jonathan Nettles sniggered.
People like you, Mrs. Forrester, make me sick to the stomach. Interfering busybody. That's what you are,
he said, storming out of the house like a belligerent bull whose feathers had been well and truly ruffled.
What was all that drama about?
Asked my husband, taking a seat at the kitchen table.
I could see the man sauntering off, as if he had a bee in his bonnet about something. What's pickled his cucumber?
Unfortunately, he's rather upset that we're all helping Rona manage her life with the jobs we're doing for her. He doesn't like our interference one bit. He wants to send her off to an old age home as soon as possible. A place like that will finish his mother off in days. He knows it.
Maybe that's the whole point, Mum,
said my oldest son, Wayne.
You know Mrs. Nettles. She's not short of a bob or two. Her house will fetch a pretty penny. Maybe he's after her nest egg.
That's a bit presumptuous of you, Wayne. I'm sure Jonathan means well, and underneath it all he has his mother's interests at heart, surely. Perhaps he's worried about his mother having another nasty fall. It does happen when people get older. But we have Rona's back, and she can always call us on her cell if she's having trouble. My husband raised a brow.
I seem to recall Rona once mentioning Jonathan having a gambling problem. Don't you remember? You don't think that's why he's desperate to sell for his mother? So that he can get his hands on some of that much-needed cash for himself to cover some of his debts?
I'm sure you're barking up the wrong tree, I said to my husband. That happened an awfully long time ago, you know. Rona hasn't mentioned Jonathan having problems in recent years with gambling. But I do remember her telling me once that she told Jonathan that she would never give him a penny to cover his gambling debts, but she would pay for him to get therapy, should the need arise. Maybe he did. You never know.
You really think a leopard can change its spots? Said my husband cynically. I think Wayne's got a very good point. I would hedge a bet he's after his mother's money.
Give the poor man a break. He might be a little aggressive, but I'm sure his heart is in the right place. My son Wayne's story. It was later on a Saturday night. Possibly it's more appropriate to actually say super early on a Sunday morning. I was riding back on my bicycle from visiting my girlfriend Sassy, who lived a few blocks away. I was really quite shocked how late in the evening it had become. Me and my girlfriend's brother Toby had prepared a delicious barbecue together. We'd sat down to drink a cold six-pack, to eat sizzling beef burgers, salad and rolls, and of course to reminisce. The time had drifted away so fast, as it invariably always does when you're having a good time. I was visibly shocked that it was already 1 o'clock in the morning, so I knew I'd better be making tracks home. At 18 years old, my parents had given me a measure of independence, which I'm afraid I exploited with very little trouble. They knew at weekends that I was rather inclined to get back late, but this was overdoing it, as I had studying to do. I knew in the morning I would be so bushed I'd never get around to doing any of my studies. I was secretly chastising myself for being so badly disciplined. I had sworn to myself I would leave the barbecue no later than 10 o'clock that evening. And look at me, I was late again. This wasn't the first time a good time had so eagerly expropriated my reason and common sense, where my best intentions had been seduced, wilfully led astray, flying out of the window like a hot air balloon, floating away into the ether. If I carried on like this any more, with such a reckless insouciance, I would not acquire the grades I needed for my university degree. It would serve me right if I didn't make the grade, I told myself sternly, as I mulled over my apathy, seriously reprimanding myself. I sailed down the streets on my bicycle, barely paying much attention to how dark it was, as I was wearing a headlamp on my head. My bicycle light lit up my path clearly, at least enough for me to focus on the long ribbon of asphalt. As I was cycling, I suddenly became assiduously aware that everything was cloaked in a conspicuous silence that was so tangible it grabbed my attention as consummately as having a bucket of ice-cold water thrown over my head. When I'd been outside only moments before drinking beers over the fire pit at my girlfriend's home, we could hear the crickets and frogs very clearly. But now there was no background noise at all. I cannot lie, it made me feel ever so slightly on edge. I could feel prickles of unease rolling down my spine. The streets were quiet. The lights of the residential homes basked in darkness. Everything was disturbingly soundless. Quite frankly, without the whishing sound of my wheels on tarmac, and my feet pushing the pedals swiftly, I think the sound of the silence would have been significantly more discomposing. I'm afraid the tenebrous black velvety night was not generous tonight in her bountiful showing, for the crescent moon, along with the clusters of silvery stars, were hidden and obscured behind a rising mist that quickly descended over our street like a morose, sinisterous, ghostly veil. As I was cycling past Mrs. Nettle's home, I stopped dead in my tracks. The lights in her kitchen were on. I knew instinctively that something was terribly wrong. A sense of dreadful foreboding overcame me. My guts recoiled. Mrs. Nettles made no secret of the fact that she retired to bed early every night. So what was she doing up at this ungodly hour of the morning? Something was distinctly off. I could feel it in my bones. So it was with great trepidation I placed my bicycle against a street lamp and made my way around to the back of Mrs. Nettle's home, where the light was on. I had a sinking feeling in my guts. I knew Mrs. Nettles had a very naughty habit of keeping her kitchen door unlocked at night, something that my family had always warned her about. Could someone have broken in, held her to ransom, I wondered. Then I heard the voice.
"Where is your money?"
with a pronounced French accent.
"Where is your money?"
I surreptitiously grabbed a sizable trowel from the yard, cautiously making my way to the back door, assertively pushing it open. It barely even creaked. For a while both Mrs. Nettles and the tall stranger in the kitchen were completely oblivious to my presence. What I saw sent a huge shiver nosediving down my spine. A man wearing a balaclava over his head, dressed in distinctive black clothing and gloves, was threatening Mrs. Nettles with what appeared to be an iron bar. He had tied the woman by her hands and legs to the chair with rope. He appeared to be demanding money. "I don't keep any money in the house," said Mrs. Nettles, tears pouring down her face. The woman was so terrified, petrified even. I realized to my horror that this doggedly determined burglar had recklessly broken all Mrs. Nettles' periwinkle china that she valued so much from her oakwood dresser.
It was lying all over the kitchen, broken into hundreds of thousands of pieces. He was going around her entire kitchen, slamming his metal pole onto everything, possibly to intimidate and steamroll the poor elderly woman. "I want money, now, or I will kill you."
"I could write you a cash cheque," said Mrs. Nettles, "but I don't keep money in the house."
I didn't think of my own safety, as the anger I felt for poor Mrs. Nettles being held to ransom by this violent thug was all-consuming. "What's going on here?" I said as I entered the kitchen, holding the large spade in my hand. I was lucky because I'm big for my age. I'm 6 foot tall, very broad in the shoulders, so I can easily stand up for myself. I've also done martial arts and judo. I could see the angry brown eyes in the balaclava seemed to grow frightened. To my amazement, the man ran away from me, out of the kitchen door, from the backyard to the front, down the long ribbon of asphalt, directly towards the woods. I began to give him chase. I was quite impressed, for he ran fast until he reached the hiking trail, still carrying the metal pole in his hands, while I'd long since relinquished the heavy spade I'd been carrying, as it would seriously have impeded my running. I was tenaciously determined to catch up with this ghastly thug, take him down with a couple of heavy punches. Who did he think he was, scaring a poor elderly lady half to death like this? I was grateful that I had the edge on this man, not only with my speed, but with the light of my headlamp still on. I dashed into the woods, trailing behind him. The tall silhouettes of the Douglas firs, western hemlocks, red cedars, western yews and black cottonwoods rose up into the sky, some tall, majestic, others shorter and dense with foliage. But as a wind had begun to blow, the boughs of the trees began to jiggle, and in the dim twilight it was seriously menacing. But I made sure my attention was not diverted. I needed to catch this thug. I lunged towards the man, grabbing his sweater, pulling him towards me, punching him in the chest several times. He winced in pain, screaming,
"Please stop! Please stop! You're hurting me! Please stop! You're hurting me!"
I successfully threw him onto the earthen ground, while the metal pole he'd been carrying simply slipped out of his hands like butter. I was now on top of him, with my buttocks resting on his chest. He was trying to fight back, but my strength overpowered him. He was screaming again for me to stop.
"Please stop! I told you! You're hurting me! Stop!"
His French accent had morphed into a pronounced southern drawl, so the French accent had been a ruse all along. With one swift tug, I pulled off the man's balaclava. I stared at him in shock. It was Jonathan Nettles, Rona Nettles' son. But instead of seeing his piercing blue eyes, his eyes were brown. Of course, I thought, he'd changed his eye colour with contact lenses. It was a clever trick you could apply nowadays.
"What the hell, Jonathan? What are you doing, scaring the life out of your poor mother there? Breaking all her china, demanding money. You saw how petrified she was. What the heck were you doing? To your own mother, for goodness sake. You can't get lower than that." "I'm in trouble," said Jonathan. "I have a $200,000 gambling debt on my back, which I have to pay in a month's time. You know what these sharks are like if you don't pay them back. I'm already paying them $50,000 in interest. Downright robbery. They've already threatened to kill me if I don't pay up, and I know they mean business. I got scared. I had to do something. I thought if I could scare my mother significantly, she would agree to sell the house as soon as possible. That's my only hope of procuring some cash." "So it's all right to go scaring your mother half to death just so you can get your hands on her money? Have you any idea how warped that sounds? No, it's not all right, I admit. But I was running out of options, thanks to your interfering mother. I knew I could pull off a French accent, cover myself in black, use brown contact lenses. She'd never recognize me. I wanted to scare her so much, so she'd sell at once. I knew it would work. Have you thought about just asking your mother for financial help? rather than behaving like a juvenile delinquent. If I tell her I'm gambling, she'll put her foot down. She refuses to support my gambling addiction. She's always made that clear to me. I can't say I blame her. Gambling is a bottomless pit. Why do you do it, mate? Surely you know these things are rigged. They're not designed to help you win, to make you rich. Everyone knows that, surely. Did you hear that? Said Jonathan suddenly, his attention diverted by something he'd heard in the woods. What? I said. That noise! Listen! I could hear what I can only describe as thundering feet moving towards us at one hell of a pace. As it neared its approach, it was like the forest floor heaved and groaned under its sizable weight. I could hear substantial tree limbs snapping like mere twigs, crashing to the ground, falling with a mighty thud, as if a tree feller was felling trees. Something of incredible girth and weight was effortlessly bolting through the thicket, pulverizing everything in its wake, like an elephant in a china shop, languidly tearing every obstruction apart. Heck is that? I said, looking at Jonathan with my eyes as wide as saucers, my jaws hanging open wide like a Venus flytrap. Then the forest was infused with the most repugnant smell that was like rotten garbage, sweat, sulphur, decomposing flesh, a smell so atrocious, so vile, that my eyes began to burn, and the desire to vomit and hurl became intense and overwhelming. For the both of us, the calamitous noise was so intimidating, so threatening, so pretentious. It felt as if we were both ensnared in a fortuitous accident scene, upon which we were powerless to change the sequence of events. Almost as if they had been commandeered from our natural ability to take any control, or to change its aftermath. Everything seemed to be happening in slow motion, as it invariably always does in any ineffectual life and death situation. In reality, things were going speedily. I wanted to tell Jonathan to run, but I couldn't even get myself to obey the orders of my own adrenaline that was coursing through my veins, instinctively perceiving that a threatening danger was looming ever closer. Even at this stage, the thunderous crashing and thrashing noise in the forest that sounded like 1,000 bison beating up the ground with their hefty hooves was so frightening. I felt as if I was watching the scene unfolding before my eyes in a detached way, like a movie at a cinema. I beheld the branches of a cottonwood tree beginning to shake ominously, as if some thing was deliberately oscillating them. For a moment I sensed eyes on me, as if I was being scrutinized by a pair of mean eyes. And then I saw him. Standing yards away from us was a formidable giant, covered in long flowing black hair, blacker than the night, darker than coal. He was the most terrifying creature that I have ever beheld, much like something that the gates of hell would offer or conjure up to you, or a monster from your darkest, most terrifying nightmares. I knew at once what it was. There was no mistake in my mind. No, none at all. It was a Bigfoot. This Titanic-sized creature stood up on 2 powerful feet, tall, lofty, majestic, fearsome, with tree-trunked legs, an ape-like face, bright red, glowing, menacious eyes that beheld no compassion or kindness, no hint of humanity. "Run!" I cried out to Jonathan. "Run! He's going to kill us!" I do not know how I sprung to life, but I did like a deer. As my limbs gained traction, my feet bounded efficiently through the wood grove, but I ran with a speed I have never been able to replicate since. Believe me, if I could run like that again, I would be winning first prizes in marathons every time. It was fear that pounded through my blood that gave me this marvellous fighting edge. I was glad to see Jonathan running beside me, as he seemed to have found this magic elixir that gave us an edge over the creature that could run like a cheetah. I could see his humongous dark form behind us with his overlong arms reaching out to grab Jonathan, but he missed him narrowly by a hair's breadth. If he had grabbed Jonathan, I do not doubt he would be dead, without a question in my mind. It seemed that luck had smiled upon us. "Run faster!" I screamed. "Run faster!"
We ran down the asphalt road with the creature hot upon our trail. I could hear his heavy breathing. "To your mother's house!" I screamed, knowing that her kitchen door would still be unlocked. To this day I still ponder how we managed to make it to Mrs. Nettle's house, but we did. We raced into that kitchen, slamming the kitchen door shut behind us. Mrs. Nettle was still tied to the chair, so I ran over to her and untied her, while Jonathan raced around the house, securing doors and windows. "What's going on?" said Mrs. Nettles, looking at her son in horror. "Oh, my word, it was you, Jonathan! You tied me up! You scared me half to death! How could you do that to your own mother? Why? Why would you do such a dreadful thing?" "I'm sorry, Mum, but forget about that now. There's something much more terrible going on in your yard. Something dangerous wants to kill us. It almost killed me moments ago." "What?" asked Mrs. Nettles, looking horrified. "What? What are you talking about? What's going on? I don't understand." "An angry Bigfoot," I told her. "He's out there. He's out there. He's wandering around your backyard. He might try and get into your house." The creature was running around Mrs. Nettle's house, peering through the windows, banging on the wooden rafters. We could hear him grunting and growling. Oh my God!" gasped Mrs. Nettles. "The thing, it's enormous! It's a Bigfoot! I can't believe it! I can't believe it! I can't believe it didn't kill the both of you! How did you manage to outrun that awful thing?" she said, grabbing us both in her arms, thankful that we were both alive. "Oh, my goodness, I could have lost you, Jonathan. That thing, he's a demon. We've got to kill him right now." Mrs. Nettles quickly grabbed a rifle from the upstairs cupboard and loaded it without flinching. We were powerless to stop her. With a steely confidence and tenacious determination, she opened the back door. The creature was standing yards away from her. A tall, dark silhouette with bright red blazing eyes came bounding towards her. But she began firing at the creature confidently, hitting him in the arm several times. I heard a loud, painful yelp. The creature turned around and glided away, going back from whence he'd come. I never felt more relieved in my entire life to see the back of anything before. I was astonished by Mrs. Nettle's bravery, but she was overwhelmed that me and Jonathan were all right, that we were unharmed. It seemed like Jonathan's former actions of holding her to ransom by tying her up to the chair had become like water off a duck's back, compared to encountering this monstrous beast that made everything else pale into insignificance. So all was forgiven and forgotten. I'm glad to inform you that Mrs. Nettles forgave Jonathan, paid off his gambling debt, insisting that in return he received help against his addiction. She continued to live in her home until the grand old age of 92, where one night she passed away peacefully in her sleep. What a beautiful way to go. We never saw the Bigfoot again, but he did get hit by one of Mrs. Nettle's bullets, as a trail of blood was traced back to that woodgrove. Whether the creature lived or died, we will never know, but I'm glad to say we never saw it again, for it was evil to its core. The hatred it beheld towards us was tangible. So there you are. That's my story.
Well, hello there. I hope you enjoyed the Omnibus edition. We've got many more coming our way for you to listen to. Sending you love wherever you are in the world, in North America, Canada, Kenya, wherever you may be. I send you lots and lots of love. Thank you for listening to my Omnibus, and I really do hope you enjoyed it, because that's the whole idea about it, is to give you some interesting stories to listen to. So until next time, goodbye and good night.